Welcome back to the Haunted Fears horror family. Oregon's wilderness hides more than just breathtaking views. Between the foggy coastlines and silent mountain peaks, something is waiting. Tonight, 11 people share what they found in the places no one talks about. These encounters will make you question every dark forest trail and every abandoned building you've ever passed. If you're ready to face what lurks in Oregon's forgotten corners, let's dive in. And if these stories send chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button and join the Haunted Fears horror family, because we're just getting started. I've been camping in Oregon my whole life, and I know what silence sounds like. But what I heard at Waldo Lake wasn't silence. It was the absence of everything. My name is Colton, and I need to tell you about something that happened last September at Waldo Lake in the Cascade Mountains. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've spent most of my adult life backpacking solo through the Pacific Northwest, and I've always found peace in the isolation of the wilderness. The deeper into the mountains I go, the more at home I feel. Or at least, that's what I used to think. Waldo Lake sits at about 5,114 feet elevation, surrounded by old-growth forest and mountain peaks. It's one of the purest lakes in the world. So clear, you can see down over 100 feet in some spots. I'd been there a handful of times before, always during summer when the crowds thin out but the weather holds. This time, I decided to go in early September, right after Labor Day weekend, when I knew I'd have the place almost entirely to myself. The hike in was perfect, about 6 miles from the trailhead, carrying everything I needed for 3 days of fishing and solitude. The weather forecast showed clear skies, cool nights, perfect conditions. I reached my usual camping spot on the northeastern shore around 3 in the afternoon, a small clearing tucked back from the water, protected by towering Douglas firs and mountain hemlock. The lake stretched out before me like a sheet of glass, so transparent I could see the rocky bottom dropping away into darkness. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the rest of the afternoon fishing from the shoreline. Caught 2 rainbow trout, both decent size. Cooked them over my fire as the sun set behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, but that's normal at that elevation in September. I pulled on an extra layer and sat by the fire, listening to the night sounds of the forest. And that's when I first noticed something was off. Usually at that time of night in the Cascades, you hear a symphony of sound. Insects buzzing, birds settling into their roosts, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through the trees. But as I sat there finishing my coffee, I realized all of that had stopped. Not gradually, like when a storm approaches and animals sense the pressure change, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The fire crackled. That was the only sound. No wind, no insects, nothing. I stood up and walked to the edge of my campsite, straining to hear anything beyond the light from my fire. The lake was perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting stars. The forest around me felt like it was holding its breath. I've experienced quiet nights before, but this was different. This wasn't peace. This was wrongness. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a bear or a mountain lion, and the smaller animals had gone silent and still. That happens. I checked that my food was properly stored in the bear canister, added more wood to the fire, and decided to call it a night. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in the wilderness. I'd dealt with that before. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., set my watch alarm for 6 a.m., and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The silence pressed against the tent walls like something physical. I lay there, eyes open, listening for anything. Minutes passed. Maybe half an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to my alarm, and the first thing I noticed was that it was still dark outside. Not dawn dark, not even pre-dawn gray, Full night dark. I checked my watch. The digital display showed 3:47 a.m., but my alarm was going off, the one I'd set for 6. I pressed the button to silence it and stared at the numbers. They were clear. 3:47 a.m. The alarm shouldn't have gone off for another 2 hours and 13 minutes. I fumbled for my phone to check the time there, and that's when the real confusion set in. My phone showed 3:47 a.m. too. Both devices agreed on the time, but I absolutely knew, I'd set that alarm for 6. I'm meticulous about that kind of thing. I've been using the same watch for 5 years on every camping trip. I don't make mistakes with it. I lay there trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd set it wrong without realizing. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But even as I tried to convince myself, something felt deeply wrong about the situation. That's when I realized the silence was still absolute. At 3:47 a.m., there should be some sounds. Night insects. The occasional hoot of an owl, wind, something. Instead, there was nothing. Not even the sound of the lake lapping at the shore, which I'd fallen asleep to countless times at other campsites. I unzipped my sleeping bag and crawled to the tent entrance. Unzipped the fly and looked outside. The moon had risen. It was about 3/4 full, providing enough light to see the clearing where I'd camped. My fire had burned down to coals, giving off a faint red glow. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the silence was suffocating. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The temperature had dropped significantly. My breath came out in visible clouds. I walked over to check the fire, added a few pieces of wood to bring it back to life. The crackling of the wood sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. That's when I noticed my footprints, or rather the absence of them. The clearing around my campsite was covered in a thin layer of frost, not unusual for this elevation in September. When I'd set up camp the previous afternoon, I'd walked all over the area, gathering firewood, setting up my tent, walking down to the lake's edge. Those footprints should have been preserved in the frost, but the ground was smooth, unmarked, except for the prints I was making right now. I stood there, staring at the pristine surface, trying to make sense of it. Had there been rain that washed them away? No, my tent was dry. Had the frost formed over them? That didn't make sense. Frost doesn't work that way. My fresh footprints showed clearly in the white rime. Older ones should have been even more visible. I walked to where I'd gathered firewood near the tree line. There should have been a trail of disturbed needles and broken twigs. Nothing. I walked to the lake's edge, where I'd stood fishing for over an hour. The shoreline was smooth, untouched. My heart started beating faster. I turned back to look at my campsite. The tent was there. My gear was there. The fire I'd built was still burning. But according to the ground, I'd never walked anywhere except in the last few minutes. I pulled out my phone, checking for any signal. Nothing. Expected out here. But I opened my photo gallery. I'd taken several pictures the previous afternoon. Shots of the lake, a selfie with my first caught fish, the sunset. I scrolled through them. They were all there. Time-stamped from yesterday, 4:17 p.m., 5:33 p.m., 7:08 p.m. Proof that I'd been here, that the previous day had happened. But the ground told a different story. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between what I could see in my phone and what I could see around me. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I walked in a wide circle around my campsite, playing my flashlight over the ground. The frost was everywhere, undisturbed except by my current footprints. I widened the circle, moving into the tree line. That's when I found the circles. 3 of them, maybe 20 feet from my tent, arranged in a triangular pattern. Each circle was about 6 feet in diameter, and within each one, the grass and moss were completely dead, brown and brittle, as if they'd been dying for weeks. But I'd walked through this exact area yesterday while gathering firewood. I would have noticed dead patches this obvious. I crouched down and touched the edge of one circle. The dead vegetation crumbled under my fingers. I pulled out my flashlight and examined the boundary. It was perfectly defined, like someone had traced it with a compass. Inside the circle, everything was dead. Outside, everything was normal. The silence pressed harder. I stood up and backed away from the circles, my mind racing through possibilities. Some kind of fungus, chemical contamination. But 3 perfect circles in a triangular pattern. That didn't happen naturally, and it definitely didn't happen overnight. I returned to my fire and sat down, feeding it more wood, creating as much light as possible. I checked my watch again. 4:23 a.m. I'd been awake for 36 minutes. Time was moving normally now, as far as I could tell, but something about the previous evening was wrong. Something about the way I'd lost those hours. The way the evidence of my presence had been erased. I decided to wait for sunrise. There was no point trying to pack up and hike out in the dark. The trail was 6 miles through dense forest, and if something strange was happening, I wasn't about to stumble through it blind. Better to stay by the fire, stay alert, and leave as soon as there was enough light. I sat there, feeding the fire, watching the darkness, and listening to the absence of sound. Minutes crawled by. I checked my watch obsessively. 4:47, 5:12, 5:39. Time was moving normally, but the sun wasn't coming. At 6 a.m., the time my alarm was originally set for, it should have been getting light. The eastern sky should have been brightening, that gray pre-dawn glow spreading over the mountains. But when I looked east, there was only darkness and stars. At 6:30 a.m., still no change. At 7 a.m., still full night. I sat by my fire, watching my watch count forward while the sun refused to rise. The silence continued, absolute and suffocating. No wind, no animals, just me and the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my heart. At 7:47 a.m., I made a decision. I couldn't wait any longer. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place, and I needed to leave. I'd hike out using my headlamp and flashlight. It would be slow and difficult, but staying here felt increasingly dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. I started breaking down my camp, moving quickly but carefully. I pulled the stakes from my tent, collapsed the poles, rolled everything into its stuff sack. I packed my sleeping bag, my cooking gear, my food. I scattered the fire and doused the coals with water from the lake. The sound of the water hitting the hot rocks was shocking in the silence, a hiss and a plume of steam. I shouldered my pack, turned on my headlamp, and started toward the trail. I'd taken maybe 3 steps when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Someone else's, or something else's moving through the forest to my left, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started again, they started. I spun toward the sound, playing my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth. Nothing moved, but I could hear the footsteps clearly now, the crunch of needles, the snap of small twigs. They weren't even trying to be quiet. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded flat and dead in the silence, like the air was swallowing the sound. The footsteps stopped. I waited, breathing hard, my flashlight steady on the spot where I thought they'd come from. Nothing. No response. No movement. I started walking again, faster now, my eyes fixed on the barely visible trail ahead. The footsteps resumed immediately, matching my pace step for step. I broke into a jog. The footsteps jogged. I ran. The footsteps ran. But they never got closer. They stayed exactly parallel to me, maybe 30 feet into the forest, keeping pace but never closing the distance. And I never saw what was making them. I ran down that trail in blind panic, my headlamp bouncing wildly, my pack slamming against my back, my breath coming in gasps. The footsteps stayed with me. For how long, I don't know. Time had stopped meaning anything. My watch said 8:13 a.m., but it was still full dark, and I'd been running for what felt like both minutes and hours. Then suddenly, it stopped. The footsteps ceased, and a second later, sound returned to the forest all at once, a wall of noise that was almost physical. birds erupting into morning song, insects buzzing, wind rushing through trees, and light. Dawn light spreading over the mountains like someone had hit fast forward. I stumbled and nearly fell, catching myself against a tree. The forest around me was bright with morning, the sun rising over the eastern peaks, golden light filtering through the canopy. I turned and looked back the way I'd come. Just normal forest, no movement, no pursuing presence. I checked my watch. 8:13 a.m., same as before. But now the light matched the time. I stood there for several minutes, listening to the normal sounds of a Cascade morning, feeling the normal warmth of sunlight on my face. Everything was as it should be, as it had always been, except for the terror still coursing through my veins and the absolute certainty that something had been wrong with the previous night. I continued hiking out, moving fast but no longer running. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, but I heard nothing unusual. No footsteps, no silence, just normal forest sounds. I reached my truck in the parking area at 10:47 a.m., about right for a 6-mile hike with a full pack. I loaded my gear, started the engine, and sat there for a moment before driving away. Part of me wanted to report what happened to a ranger, but what would I even say? The night lasted too long. My footprints disappeared. Something followed me. Instead, I drove back to Eugene, trying to process what I'd experienced. When I got home, I charged my phone and went through my photos again. All the ones from the previous afternoon were still there. But when I checked the metadata, something made my blood run cold. The photos showed the correct dates and times for when I'd taken them, but the GPS coordinates were all slightly off. Not by much, maybe 50 or 60 feet, but enough to notice. Like I'd been standing in a slightly different location than where I actually was. Or like the location itself had shifted. I've been researching Waldo Lake since that trip. I found stories about its unusual clarity, its ancient formation, the way it sits at a tectonic fault. I found references to Native American legends about the area, though specific details are scattered and hard to verify. But I haven't found any official reports of missing time or spatial anomalies. What I did find were a handful of old forum posts, the kind you have to dig for, buried in obscure outdoor recreation websites. Posts from other people describing similar experiences at Waldo Lake. A couple from 2017 about absolute silence falling over the forest. One from 2012 about time skipping during the night. Another from 2019 about footprints vanishing despite clearly being made hours before. None of them got much attention. Most of the responses were skeptical or dismissive, but reading them, I knew these people weren't lying. They'd experienced what I'd experienced. They'd felt that same wrongness. I haven't been back to Waldo Lake. I don't know if I ever will. Part of me thinks it was some kind of localized phenomenon, maybe related to the geology, maybe to something else entirely. Part of me thinks whatever happened that night has always been happening at Waldo Lake, and most people just don't notice it. They come during the day, stay during normal hours, leave before the strangeness begins. But I noticed. And now I can't unknow what I know, that there are places in Oregon's wilderness where the rules we take for granted stop applying, where time moves strangely, where evidence of our presence can vanish, where something walks in the darkness, matching your footsteps. The Cascades are full of beautiful places, peaceful places. Places where you can find solitude and clarity and connection with nature. Waldo Lake still looks like one of those places if you visit during the day. The water is still impossibly clear. The forests are still pristine. The mountains are still majestic. But I know what happens when the sun should set but doesn't. When silence falls like a weight. When the ground forgets you were ever there. And I know that something lives in those moments between normal time and whatever time that was. Something that follows, something that watches, something that exists in the spaces where our reality wears thin. I'm sharing this because I think people should know. If you go to Waldo Lake, go during the day. Leave before dusk. Don't camp overnight, especially not in September. And if you find yourself there as darkness falls and the sounds of the forest stop all at once, don't wait to see what happens next. Get out. Move fast. Don't look back. Because I did wait. I did stay. And now I know that some silences aren't empty at all. They're full of things we aren't meant to encounter. Things that exist outside the normal flow of time and space. Things that walk alongside us in the dark, matching our footsteps. Waiting for something I'm grateful I never found out. That's my story. That's what happened to me at Waldo Lake last September. I know how it sounds. I know what people will think, but I also know what I experienced, and I know I'm not the only one. The Cascades keep their secrets well. Most of them stay hidden, but sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, the boundary between the world we know and whatever lies beyond it becomes thin enough to notice. And once you've noticed, you can't ever fully forget. If you found this story disturbing and want to hear more real experiences from Oregon's darkest places, make sure you subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, some places in this world aren't meant for us. We're just visitors passing through territories far older and stranger than we can imagine. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. They call it Idiotville because only an idiot would go there. I went there twice, the first time out of curiosity, the second time because I had to know if what I saw was real. My name is Ernesto, and I'm what you'd call an urban explorer. I've spent the last 7 years photographing abandoned places across the Pacific Northwest. Old mills, forgotten logging camps, ghost towns swallowed by forest. Most of them are harmless, just decaying wood and rusted metal slowly returning to nature. Idiotville wasn't like the others. The place sits deep in the Tillamook State Forest, about a mile off Highway 6, accessible only by crossing Idiot Creek on a fallen log that's been there since God knows when. It's what's left of a logging camp from the 1930s, one of dozens that got wiped out during the Tillamook burn, a series of massive forest fires that scorched over 350,000 acres between 1933 and 1951. Most camps were abandoned and forgotten. A few became curiosities for people like me. I first heard about Idiotville from another explorer I met at a coffee shop in Portland. He showed me some photos on his phone. Collapsed buildings, rusty equipment, half buried in moss. That eerie beauty that comes with total abandonment. He mentioned the name, laughed about how you had to be an idiot to cross that creek on a rotting log, and said it was worth the risk for the shots. He didn't mention anything else. Looking back, I wonder if he even made it to the actual camp, or if he just photographed the outskirts and left. I went on a Tuesday in late October. The weather forecast showed overcast but dry, perfect for photography, since harsh sunlight ruins shots of places like this. I parked at a pullout on Highway 6, where the old logging road begins, barely visible now, choked with ferns and salal. The hike to Idiot Creek took about 20 minutes through dense rainforest, that typical Tillamook growth, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, everything dripping with moisture even when it hasn't rained. The creek itself was running high from recent rain, maybe 15 feet across, cold and dark and fast. The fallen log that served as a bridge was massive, probably 4 feet in diameter, but slick with moss and lichen. I took my time crossing, using my tripod as a balance pole. The whole time I could hear the water rushing underneath, and I remember thinking how stupid this was, risking a fall into freezing water for some photos. But I made it across. The old logging road continued on the other side, more visible here, cutting through second-growth forest that had reclaimed the burn area. I followed it for another 10 minutes before the first structures appeared. A collapsed equipment shed, walls caved in, roof gone entirely. Then another building, more intact but leaning hard to one side. and finally the main camp, Idiotville. About a dozen structures in various states of decay, arranged around what had once been a central yard. Bunkhouses, a mess hall, storage buildings, maybe an office, all of them slowly being consumed by the forest. Douglas fir saplings growing through floors, moss covering everything like a thick green blanket. It was beautiful in that melancholic way abandoned places always are. Evidence of human effort and life, now silent and forgotten. I spent the first hour just walking the perimeter, getting a feel for the place, deciding on angles and shots. The light was perfect, filtering through the canopy in soft gray tones. I photographed the collapsed mess hall, the rusted remains of an old truck, a bunkhouse with its door hanging open like a mouth. Standard stuff. The camp was quiet except for forest sounds. Birds, the distant rush of the creek, wind through trees. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to explore inside one of the more intact bunkhouses. The door was off its hinges, leaning against the exterior wall. I stepped inside carefully, testing each floorboard before putting my weight on it. The interior was gutted. Anything valuable had been stripped decades ago, but there were still bunk frames bolted to the walls, a collapsed wood stove in the corner, broken glass scattered everywhere. I was setting up a shot of the window, light streaming through the broken panes, when I heard footsteps outside. Not casual footsteps, deliberate ones, moving at the same pace I'd been moving earlier. Crunch, crunch, crunch through the undergrowth and debris. I froze, listening. My first thought was another explorer, someone else who'd heard about the place, but I hadn't seen any vehicles at the pullout, and it seemed unlikely someone would arrive right when I was here. "Hello," I called out, moving to the doorway. The footsteps stopped. I waited, but there was no response. No hello back, no sound of movement, just silence. I stepped outside, looking around the camp. Nothing. No movement. No one visible among the buildings. "Hey, I'm just taking some photos," I said, louder this time. "Didn't mean to startle you." Still nothing. I stood there for a minute, feeling slightly foolish for talking to no one. I convinced myself it had been an animal, a deer maybe, or an elk. The forest was full of them. They could sound surprisingly human-like when moving through brush. I went back inside and finished my shot, but I was more aware now, listening. The forest sounds had resumed, birds calling, branches creaking. Normal stuff. I moved to another building, an old storage shed with most of its roof intact. Got some good shots of deteriorating tools, a shovel with a wooden handle gone completely soft with rot. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, maybe 30 feet away, moving parallel to me as I walked from the shed back toward the central yard. And here's what made my skin crawl. They matched my pace exactly. When I took a step, they took a step. When I stopped, they stopped. I spun toward the sound, camera raised like I was going to take a photo, but really just wanting, something in my hands. "I can hear you," I said. "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped again, but this time I heard something else, a kind of shuffling sound, like something moving position, repositioning itself. It came from behind one of the collapsed bunkhouses, hidden from view. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't play games like this. Animals don't match your footsteps or hide behind buildings. "Look, I'm leaving," I announced, backing toward the path that led to the creek. "Just here for photos. I'm going now." I turned and started walking, faster than before, not quite running, but close. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and quick, and underneath it, I could hear them again. Footsteps, following me, still matching my pace, but now behind me, maybe 20 feet back. I didn't turn around. Something primal in my brain was screaming at me not to look, just to keep moving. I reached the edge of the camp where the old logging road began, and the footsteps were still there, still following, still perfectly synchronized with my own. I started running. The footsteps ran too. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my camera bag slamming against my side. The old logging road was barely visible, but I followed it by instinct and memory, my breath coming in gasps. Behind me, something was moving through the undergrowth, fast, keeping pace. But here's the thing. It didn't sound like running. It sounded wrong. The rhythm was off, like something with too many legs, or legs that bent in the wrong places. And it was breathing, heavy and wet, a sound that was almost like laughter. I reached Idiot Creek in what felt like seconds, but must have been minutes. The log was there, slick and treacherous, and I didn't care. I ran across it, arms windmilling for balance, my feet sliding on moss. I made it about 3/4 of the way before I lost my footing and fell. The impact, with the water, knocked the air from my lungs. The creek was shockingly cold, maybe 40 degrees, and the current was stronger than it looked. I went under, my camera bag dragging me down, and for a second I panicked, thrashing. Then my feet hit bottom, and I pushed up, gasping. I was only in chest-deep water, but the cold was already making my muscles seize. I half swam, half crawled to the opposite bank, grabbing exposed roots and pulling myself out. I collapsed on the muddy shore, shaking violently, water streaming from my clothes. And that's when I looked back. Something was standing on the other side of the creek, not on the bank. On the log I'd just fallen from, perfectly balanced, perfectly still. It was shaped like a person, roughly. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past where the knees should be. The legs bent backward at the joints. And the head was tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, cocked to one side like a curious dog. Couldn't see its face. The light was wrong, or maybe there was no face to see, just a darkness where features should have been. It stood there, on that slick log, without moving, without breathing, just watching me with that tilted head. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me on the bank shaking with cold and fear, it on the log watching. Could have been seconds. Could have been minutes. Time felt stretched and wrong. Then it moved, not toward me. It turned. That whole body moving as one piece, no natural articulation, and walked back along the log toward the far bank. Its feet didn't slip. It didn't need to balance. It moved like gravity didn't quite work the same for it. When it reached the other side, it stepped off the log and into the forest. I watched its shape disappear between the trees, moving in that wrong way, legs bending backward, arms swinging too far forward. And then it was gone. I sat there on the bank until I couldn't stand the cold anymore. Then I forced myself up and ran. Actually ran, soaking wet, shaking. My camera bag miraculously still around my neck, though I couldn't have cared less about it. I ran back to the highway, to my car, and I didn't stop shaking until I had the engine running and the heat on full blast. I should have gone home. I should have written the whole thing off as a hallucination, hypothermia, fear playing tricks. But I couldn't. For the next 3 weeks, that thing was all I could think about. That tilted head, those backward bending legs, the way it moved. I had to know if it was real. I went back on a Thursday in mid-November, better prepared this time. Waterproof boots, a rope for crossing the creek safely, a GoPro strapped to my chest to record everything. I told myself I'd just go to the edge of the camp, stay in the open, get some footage, and leave. Just enough to prove I hadn't imagined it. The hike to the creek was the same. The crossing was easier with a rope tied to trees on both banks. The old logging road looked just as it had before. But when I reached the camp, I knew immediately something was different. The buildings had been disturbed. Not by weather or decay, by something else. The door I'd photographed hanging off its hinges was now lying 50 feet away in the undergrowth. The collapsed roof of the mess hall had been pushed aside, timbers scattered like matchsticks, and in the central yard, where I'd walked and photographed, there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, drag marks, long, deep gouges in the earth, crisscrossing the yard in chaotic patterns, like something had been pulled or dragged in circles. Some of the marks ended at building walls, others disappeared into the forest. I stood at the edge of the camp, my GoPro recording, my heart hammering. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Whatever I'd seen 3 weeks ago had been back here, doing what? Moving things, searching for something. I should have left right then, but I saw something near the old equipment shed that made me take a step closer, then another. It was my tripod. I dropped it during my panicked run last time. Hadn't even thought about it afterward. But here it was, standing upright in the middle of the yard, planted in the dirt like someone had deliberately positioned it, placed exactly where I'd be sure to see it. I approached slowly, every nerve screaming at me to run. The tripod was undamaged, still extended to the height I'd set it, legs spread stable. I reached out and touched it, half expecting it to be cold or wrong somehow, but it was just metal and plastic. My tripod. That's when I heard the breathing, not behind me, all around me, from every building simultaneously, a wet, rasping breath that sounded like it was coming from a dozen throats at once. In and out, perfectly synchronized. I grabbed the tripod and ran. Didn't look back, didn't try to see what was making that sound. I just ran, clutching my equipment, my boots pounding the old logging road. The breathing followed me, echoing through the forest, until I crossed the creek, and it stopped all at once, cut off like someone had closed a door. I made it to my car, threw everything in the back, and drove straight to Portland. I haven't been back to Tillamook State Forest since. I haven't done any urban exploration since, actually. That was my last trip. But here's the thing that still haunts me. When I reviewed the GoPro footage later, I found something I hadn't noticed at the time. In the final seconds before I grabbed the tripod and ran, there's movement in the background, just visible at the edge of the frame behind one of the bunkhouses. Something standing there, watching me, with its head tilted to the side. And in the audio, underneath my breathing and heartbeat, you can hear it. Faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps matching mine, step for step, even though I was standing still. I've tried to find information about Idiotville since then. There's not much. A few forum posts from other explorers, most of them describing it as creepy but cool. One post from 2019 mentions weird sounds but nothing specific. Another from 2016 talks about feeling watched but dismisses it as paranoia. Only one post gave me chills. It was from 2013, buried deep in an old blog. The explorer wrote about crossing Idiot Creek and seeing something in the camp that moved wrong. They didn't elaborate. The blog hasn't been updated since. I've thought about reporting what I saw to someone. Forest Service, police, I don't know. But report what, exactly? That I saw something I can't explain in an abandoned logging camp. That something mimicked my footsteps and arranged my tripod like a calling card. That there's something in Tillamook Forest that isn't an animal, isn't human, but is definitely aware. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I'm crazy. But I have the GoPro footage. I have my tripod, which I keep in my garage now, too afraid to use it. And I have the memory of that thing standing on the log, head tilted, watching me with what should have been a face but wasn't. Idiotville earned its name, and I was the idiot who went there twice. The logging camp is still there, still slowly being reclaimed by the forest. And something else is still there too, moving between the buildings, matching the footsteps of anyone foolish enough to visit, watching with that terrible tilted head. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it was a logger who died in the Tillamook burn and came back wrong, or something older that was there before the camp, or something that shouldn't exist at all. But I know it's territorial. I know it wants you to know it's there. And I know it doesn't like visitors. So if you're ever driving Highway 6 through Tillamook Forest and you see an old logging road disappearing into the trees, keep driving. If you hear about a place called Idiotville and think it would make for cool photos, trust me, it's not worth it. And if you ever find yourself crossing Idiot Creek on a fallen log, hearing footsteps that match your own, don't look back. Don't stop. Just run. Because some places aren't abandoned. Some places still have residents. And whatever lives in Idiotville doesn't want company. It wants witnesses who will leave afraid and never come back, carrying the story of what walks those ruins. I'm one of those witnesses now, and I'm telling you this because someone needs to know. That place is marked on no official maps, protected by no rangers, visited by no tourists. It exists in a gap, a forgotten space where something has made its home. And it's still there, waiting in the ruins, ready to follow the next person who's foolish enough to cross that creek. They call it Idiotville for a reason. I just wish I'd understood why before I went there the first time. Before I saw what I saw. Before I learned that some abandoned places aren't empty at all. If you're still watching and these stories are getting under your skin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join the Haunted Fears horror family. There are 9 more stories from Oregon's darkest corners coming your way, and trust me, it only gets worse from here. Drop a like if Idiotville is a place you'll never visit, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. Everyone says Crater Lake is beautiful, and they're right. What they don't tell you is that some people can't stop looking at it. My name is Fisher, and I'm a landscape photographer. I've spent 15 years chasing perfect shots across the American West. Sunrise over the Grand Canyon, storms rolling across Death Valley, alpenglow on the Tetons. I've seen hundreds of lakes, from tiny alpine tarns to massive reservoirs. None of them ever held me the way Crater Lake did. None of them ever tried to pull me in. It happened in February of last year. I'd been planning the trip for months, waiting for the right conditions. Fresh snow, clear skies, minimal crowds. Crater Lake in winter is spectacular but difficult to access. The rim road closes, and you can only reach certain viewpoints. Most photographers go in summer when everything's accessible, and the water shows that impossible sapphire blue. But I wanted something different. I wanted the caldera ringed with snow, the deep blue water contrasting against white, the isolation of winter. I drove up from Klamath Falls on a Tuesday morning, the roads clear, but banked with snow on both sides. The park entrance station was closed for the season, so I continued up to Rim Village, one of the few areas accessible year-round. There were maybe 3 other cars in the parking lot, cross-country skiers probably, or other photographers hoping for the same shots I was. I loaded my pack with camera gear, extra batteries, they die fast and cold, and snowshoes for the deeper drifts. The temperature was in the low 20s, and the wind coming off the caldera was bitter. I bundled up and headed toward the rim. The first glimpse of Crater Lake always takes your breath away. No matter how many photos you've seen, it's almost 2,000 feet deep, formed when Mount Mazama collapsed after a volcanic eruption nearly 8,000 years ago. The water is fed entirely by rain and snow. No rivers flow in or out, which is why it's so absurdly clear and blue. The caldera walls drop straight down to the water, creating this perfect bowl of impossible color surrounded by snow and rock. I stood at the rim, setting up my tripod, and looked down at that blue. It was darker in winter, deeper, like someone had poured liquid sapphire into a stone cup. The surface was absolutely calm despite the wind. Not a ripple, not a wave, just perfect glassy stillness. I started shooting. Wide angles of the whole caldera, telephoto shots of Wizard Island, the volcanic cone rising from the water, detail shots of the snow-covered cliffs. The light was perfect, that soft gray winter light that makes colors pop without harsh shadows. I worked methodically, checking compositions, adjusting settings, moving to different viewpoints along the rim. About an hour in, I realized I hadn't looked away from the lake once, not to check the parking lot behind me, not to scan for other compositional elements, not even to look at the back of my camera to review shots. My eyes kept returning to that blue water, drawn back like a magnet. I'd set up a shot, press the shutter, and immediately turn back to stare at the lake. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Focus, I told myself. You're here to work. But even as I thought it, my eyes drifted back to the water. There was something hypnotic about it. The color, maybe, or the stillness. The way it sat there, perfectly contained, perfectly calm, while wind whipped snow across the rim. I found myself wondering what it would feel like to touch that water, to break that perfect surface. I set up another shot, this time pointing my camera at the Watchman viewpoint across the caldera. But I couldn't frame it properly because I couldn't stop looking at the water. My viewfinder showed rocks and snow, but my eyes kept sliding past the frame, down the caldera wall, to that blue. Time passed. I don't know how much. The light shifted. Later afternoon now, based on the angle, but I hadn't noticed it changing. My fingers were numb inside my gloves. My face hurt from the cold. None of it seemed to matter. I lowered my camera and just looked. The lake looked back. I know how that sounds. Lakes don't look at anything. They're just water, just geology, just light refracting through depth. But I felt it. A presence, an attention, something beneath that perfect surface, aware that I was standing on the rim. Aware and waiting. I should have left then, should have packed my gear and walked back to the parking lot and driven away. But I couldn't. Literally could not turn away. My body refused the command. My legs wouldn't move. My head wouldn't turn. I stood there, hands on the railing at the viewpoint, staring down at the water, and I couldn't stop. The blue seemed to deepen, or maybe I was seeing deeper into it. Past the surface, through the clarity, down to where the light faded, and the color turned from sapphire to navy, to something darker than darkness. There were things down there, not fish. The lake has very little fish life. Something else. Shapes moving slowly in the depths, too large to be natural, too deliberate to be currents. My hands tightened on the railing. Ice bit into my palms, even through my gloves. The wind had stopped, I realized. Or maybe I just couldn't feel it anymore. Everything had narrowed to the water, and the shapes moving beneath it. One of them was rising. Slowly, impossibly slowly. Something was ascending from the deep center of the lake. I could track its progress by the color change in the water above it. Dark blue becoming lighter, lighter, almost turquoise as it neared the surface. It was huge. Bigger than Wizard Island. Bigger than anything that could fit in the caldera. I wanted to run. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to move, to get away from the rim, to put distance between myself and whatever was coming up from below. But my body wouldn't respond. My feet felt rooted to the snow. My hands were frozen to the railing. The shape was almost at the surface now. I could see details, curves and angles that didn't make sense, geometry that hurt to look at, something that was both stone and flesh and neither. The water bulged above it, smooth and unbroken, like it was pressing up against glass. And then I heard my name. Not spoken, not called out loud, but present in my head with absolute clarity, in a voice that sounded like grinding glaciers and collapsing mountains and water under impossible pressure. Fisher. My vision started to narrow. The edges went dark, tunneling down until all I could see was that bulging water and the thing beneath it. My chest felt tight. I realized distantly that I hadn't taken a breath in. How long? A minute, 2. Come closer. My body moved, not by choice. I felt my feet shift, my weight lean forward, my hands release the railing. I was going to climb over. I was going to walk down the snow-covered slope toward the water. And when I reached the edge, I was going to keep walking. A hand grabbed my shoulder. The contact broke whatever had hold of me like shattering ice. I gasped, sucking in air, and stumbled backward. My vision expanded, color and light flooding back. The hand on my shoulder steadied me as I almost fell. "Whoa, easy there," a voice said. Human. Normal. "You okay, friend?" I turned and saw a park ranger, a woman, maybe mid-40s, bundled in winter gear with a radio on her belt. She was looking at me with concern and something else, something that said she knew exactly what had just happened. "You need to step back from the rim," she said, still holding my shoulder. "Come on, back to the parking lot." My voice was hoarse, like I'd been screaming. I know what you were doing, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Come on, walk with me. She guided me away from the viewpoint, her hand firm on my shoulder, physically turning me so my back was to the lake. The moment I couldn't see the water anymore, my legs went weak. I stumbled, and she caught me, supporting my weight. Deep breaths, she said. Focus on the trees, on the parking lot, on anything except the lake. I followed her instructions, forcing myself to look at the lodge building, the snow-covered pines, my own footprints leading from the parking lot. Anything but that blue. We reached my car, and she helped me lean against it. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get my keys out of my pocket. She did it for me, unlocked the door, and helped me into the driver's seat. How long was I standing there? I asked. She checked her watch. I've been watching you for about 20 minutes. Before that. She shrugged. Your car's been here since this morning. It's 4:30 now. 7.5 hours. I'd lost 7.5 hours staring at the water. What? I started, but she cut me off. Crater Lake is sacred to the Klamath tribes, she said. They have stories about it, old stories, about what lives in the deep and what happens to people who stare too long. The Park Service doesn't talk about it. Bad for tourism. But those of us who work here year-round, we know. We watch for it. Watch for what? People who can't look away, she said simply. It doesn't happen often, maybe once or twice a season. Usually in winter when there aren't many visitors. Always when someone's alone. She paused. The water calls to certain people. People who are receptive, I guess. Artists, usually. Photographers. People who see things differently. What would have happened if you hadn't stopped me? She looked back toward the rim, then back at me. You would have walked to the edge and kept walking. They'd find your camera equipment at the rim, your footprints in the snow leading straight down the caldera wall. And eventually, maybe in spring or summer, a ranger or a hiker would spot something in the water. Just a shape, very deep, that might be a person. Might be. My hands gripped the steering wheel. That's happened before. More times than the Park Service will ever admit, she said. This place is old. Older than the mountain that collapsed to make it. The Klamath call it Giwas, a sacred place, home to powerful spirits. Some of those spirits don't want to be looked at. Some of them look back. She handed me my keys. You need to leave. Now. Don't stop until you're out of the park. And don't come back. Not in winter, not alone, not ever. The lake has seen you now. It knows you. If you come back, it'll be easier for it to hold you. I have thousands of dollars in equipment up there, I said weakly, gesturing toward where I'd left my tripod. Leave it, she said flatly. I'll collect it later. You need to go. I wanted to argue. That was a $3,000 camera, professional lenses, gear I'd saved for years to buy. But looking at her face, at the absolute certainty there, I knew she was right. That equipment was already gone. I'd lost it the moment I couldn't look away. I started the engine with shaking hands. She stepped back from the car, watching me with that same concerned, knowing expression. One more thing, she said through the window. If you start dreaming about the lake, about the blue water, about diving in, you call someone. Talk about it. Don't keep it to yourself. It's strongest when you're alone. I nodded and put the car in gear. I drove out of that parking lot without looking back, without checking my mirror, keeping my eyes locked on the road ahead. Even so, I could feel the lake behind me, that blue presence, vast and patient and waiting. The drive back to Klamath Falls was a blur. I checked into a motel and slept for 12 hours straight, dreamless and exhausted. When I woke up, I checked my phone and found dozens of photos I didn't remember taking. All of them were of the lake. Just the lake, zoomed in closer and closer on the water's surface, like I was trying to see something beneath it. The last photo was taken at 4:27 p.m., about 3 minutes before. The ranger found me. It was completely black except for a shape in the center. Something large and pale rising through dark blue. I deleted it immediately and then deleted it from my trash folder too. I never went back to Crater Lake. I never picked up my equipment. The ranger mailed me my camera bag 2 weeks later with a note. Found this at the rim. The camera and lenses were damaged. Looks like they fell. Maybe don't chase this hobby anymore. Take care. The camera body was intact, but the lens had been shattered from the inside out, like something had pressed against the glass from within. All my memory cards were blank. Not erased. Blank, like they'd never recorded anything. I haven't done landscape photography since then. I sold all my remaining equipment and took up portrait work instead. Controlled environments, artificial light, nothing that requires staring at natural beauty for hours. My friends think I burned out. My family thinks I had some kind of breakdown up at the lake. They're not wrong, but I know what really happened. I looked too long at something that didn't want to be seen, something ancient and vast and patient that lives in the deepest, clearest water in North America. Something that calls to people like me, people who see the world through viewfinders, who try to capture beauty and freeze it in time. The Klamath tribes were right to treat Crater Lake as sacred, right to warn people away, right to understand that some places exist at the boundary between our world and something older. The Park Service built viewing platforms and visitor centers and roads, trying to make it safe and accessible and normal. But the lake remembers what it was before all that. It remembers being Giwas, a place of power and spirit and danger. I still think about it sometimes, even though I try not to. Late at night, or early in the morning when the light is soft and blue. I think about that perfect stillness, that impossible color, that sense of something vast and aware beneath the surface. I think about how easy it would be to go back, to stand at the rim again and just look, to let that presence take hold and pull me down into the deep. That's when I call someone. Anyone. My sister, a friend, even the crisis helpline once. I talk about anything, work, weather, what I had for dinner, anything to break the grip of that memory, that pull, because the ranger was right. The lake knows me now. It's in my head, in my dreams, when I don't guard against it carefully enough. And if I went back, if I stood at that rim again, I wouldn't need 7 hours this time. I'd walk straight to the edge and keep walking. So I stay away. I live in Nevada now, as far from Oregon as I could manage while staying in the West. I don't photograph water anymore. I don't even like looking at lakes, even small ones, even clearly man-made reservoirs. Because I know what's possible now. I know that water can be more than water, that beauty can be a trap, that some places don't just exist. They watch and wait and call to you. And if you're unlucky enough to hear that call, if you're receptive enough to feel that pull, then the only thing that saves you is someone breaking the connection before you're too far gone. I got lucky. The ranger was watching. She knew the signs, and she got to me in time. But I think about all the people who weren't lucky, all the photographers and artists and dreamers who stood at that rim over the decades and centuries, staring at that impossible blue, and couldn't stop, who walked down the caldera wall because they had to, because something ancient and hungry had hold of them. The Park Service calls them accidents when they find the bodies or the equipment. Missing persons, tragic falls. They don't talk about the pattern, how it's always in winter, always when someone's alone, always people who came to capture the beauty. But the rangers who work there year-round, they know. The Klamath tribes know. And now I know. Crater Lake is beautiful. Everyone says so. But beauty isn't always safe. Sometimes it's a lure. Sometimes it's a trap. And sometimes, when you stare long enough into that perfect blue, something stares back and decides it wants you. If these Oregon stories are keeping you up at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and become part of our horror family. We've got 8 more disturbing accounts coming your way. Hit that like button if you'll never look at Crater Lake the same way again. And remember, some beauty demands respect, not photographs. I'll see you in the next one. My grandfather served at that station on Tillamook Bay. He told me once that some men never leave their posts even after they die. My name is Teddy, and I need to tell you about what happened at Piers End Coast Guard Station in Garibaldi last November. I'm not military, never have been, but my grandfather was. 30 years in the Coast Guard, most of it spent at stations along the Oregon coast. He passed away when I was 16, almost 20 years ago now, but I still remembered the stories he used to tell. Most of them were about rescues and storms and the brotherhood of the service. But there was one story he only told me once, late at night when my grandmother was already asleep. He told me about the men who stayed. I grew up in Tillamook County, moved away for college and work, but came back about 5 years ago when my mother got sick. After she passed, I stayed. Bought a small house in Garibaldi, right on the bay. It's a fishing town, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. The pier stretches out into Tillamook Bay, and at the end of it sits the old Coast Guard station, condemned for the past 15 years, slowly rotting into the water. Everyone in town knows not to go out there at night. It's not an official rule. The station isn't even fenced off properly. But it's understood. The fishermen who work the bay, the locals who've lived here their whole lives, they all know. You don't go to Piers End after dark, especially not in November, especially not when the fog rolls in. I knew the stories, of course. Every coastal town has its ghost tales, its haunted lighthouses, and cursed ships. Most of them are just stories to tell tourists or scare teenagers. But my grandfather's voice, when he told me about Piers End, wasn't the voice of someone sharing a campfire tale. It was the voice of someone who'd seen something he couldn't explain and spent the rest of his life trying not to think about it. Some nights, he'd said, you could see lights in the windows, shadows moving inside like the station was still active, but when you went to check, there was never anyone there. Just cold air and the smell of the ocean and something else. Something wrong. I'd asked him what the something else was, and he'd gone quiet for a long time before answering. Old fear, he'd finally said. The kind that doesn't go away when the emergency ends. The kind that stays in a place. I thought about that conversation a lot over the years, especially after I moved back. I'd walk along the pier sometimes during the day, when the sun was out and the bay was full of boats. The old Coast Guard station looked harmless then. Just another abandoned building, weathered and gray, windows boarded up, paint peeling. Just decay and time. But I never went at night. Not until last November. It was the anniversary of my grandfather's death, November 17th. I'd been thinking about him all day, looking through old photos, reading the letters he'd written to my grandmother during his deployments. I was restless, too full of memories to sleep, so around 11 p.m. I decided to go for a walk, clear my head, maybe feel closer to him somehow. I ended up at the pier without really planning to. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick and cold, turning the streetlights into dim halos. The fishing boats were tied up for the night, their masts creaking in the wind. I started walking, my boots loud on the wooden planks, the water dark and invisible below. I told myself I'd just go halfway, maybe to where the working part of the pier ended and the condemned section began. But when I got there, I kept walking. The fog was thicker here, swirling around me, and I could barely see 10 feet ahead. But I could see the station, a dark shape at the end of the pier, and something about it pulled me forward. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else entirely. But I kept walking until I was standing in front of the old building, close enough to touch the weathered boards. That's when I saw the lights. Not bright lights, not modern electric lights, but dim, flickering illumination coming from inside the station, visible through gaps in the boarded windows, like oil lamps or old navigation lanterns, the kind they would have used decades ago. I stood there, my heart pounding, my breath coming out in visible clouds. The logical part of my brain said it was probably teenagers, urban explorers, someone messing around in the old building. But the part that remembered my grandfather's story said something different. I should have left. Should have turned around and walked back to town and forgotten what I'd seen. But instead, I moved closer, pressing my face against one of the gaps in the boards, trying to see inside. The interior was lit by that same dim, flickering light. I could see the main room, what would have been the operations center when the station was active. And I could see shadows, figures moving with purpose, like they were responding to an emergency. Their movements were urgent but organized, the kind of choreographed chaos you see when trained people are dealing with a crisis. I watched, transfixed, as the shadows moved between what looked like equipment stations and communication posts. I could see them gesturing, pointing, moving with that distinctive military efficiency. And then I realized I could see their uniforms. Old Coast Guard dress, the kind from the 1950s or 60s, before they updated the designs. The kind my grandfather wore in his earliest service photos. My breath caught. This wasn't teenagers. This wasn't explorers or vandals. This was something else entirely. One of the figures moved toward the window where I was watching. I could see him more clearly now. A man in his 30s, dark hair, strong jaw, wearing the old uniform with its distinctive insignia. His face was tight with concentration, eyes focused on something I couldn't see. He was shouting something, his mouth moving urgently, but I couldn't hear any sound. Then he turned and looked directly at me. His eyes met mine through the gap in the boards, and I felt cold flood through my body. Not from the November air, from something deeper. His expression didn't change. He didn't look surprised or angry. He just looked at me with that same intense focus, like I was another piece of information to process during the emergency. Then all the other figures turned too. All at once, in perfect synchronization, every shadow in that room rotated to face the window where I stood. A dozen pairs of eyes, maybe more, all fixed on me, all completely silent. I stumbled backward, nearly falling on the wet pier. The lights inside the station flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The darkness was total, absolute, like the building had swallowed all the light. And in that darkness, I heard it. Footsteps, not outside. Inside the station, moving toward the door. Multiple sets of footsteps, synchronized, marching with military precision, getting closer. I ran. I don't know how I didn't fall off the pier in that fog. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, my boots slipping on wet wood, my lungs burning with cold air. The footsteps followed me. I could hear them clearly, even over my own panicked breathing, even over the wind and the water. They stayed the same distance behind me, neither gaining nor falling back, just maintaining that measured marching pace. When I finally reached the shore end of the pier, I collapsed against a piling, gasping. I turned to look back, expecting to see figures emerging from the fog, but there was nothing. Just gray mist and darkness, and the distant shape of the condemned station. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed there for several minutes, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, faint but clear, cutting through the fog from the direction of the station. "What is your authorization?" It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just a question, asked in the professional tone of someone doing their job. The voice of someone who'd found an unauthorized person in a restricted area and needed to know why they were there. I didn't answer. I got up and walked back to my house as fast as I could without running, my hands shaking, that voice echoing in my head. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Shadows and fog and grief playing tricks on my mind, the power of suggestion after thinking about my grandfather all day. A group of reenactors doing some kind of historical commemoration. Anything but the truth my grandfather had tried to warn me about. The next morning, I went to the local library and started researching. The librarian, a woman in her 60s who'd lived in Garibaldi her whole life, gave me a knowing look when I asked about Piers End, Coast Guard Station. "You went out there," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She sighed and pulled out a folder from behind the desk, the kind of local history collection that never makes it into the official archives. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten accounts. November 17th, 1962, she said, pointing to a yellowed article. There was a storm. 3 fishing boats got into trouble in the bay. The Coast Guard station launched a rescue operation. Everyone on duty that night went out. All 12 men. What happened? They saved 2 of the boats, she said quietly. Brought 17 fishermen back alive. But while they were out there, a rogue wave capsized their own vessel. They called it in, said they were going down, said they'd done their duty, saved everyone they could. Then the radio went silent. She showed me another clipping, this one from a week later. They found the boat smashed against the rocks near Cape Meares. They found some of the gear, some of the equipment. But they never found the bodies. All 12 men, just gone. Lost to the bay. I stared at the article, at the grainy photos of the wrecked rescue boat, at the list of names of the men who died. And there, 4th from the top, I saw a name that made my heart stop. Joseph Keller, my grandfather's best friend from his early service years. The man he'd served with at Piers End before transferring to a different station. The man he'd told me about in those late-night stories, always with sadness in his voice. People see things out there, the librarian continued, especially on November 17th, especially when the fog comes in. The fishermen know. We all know. Those men never stopped working. They finished their rescue, saved everyone they could, and then they died. But their duty didn't end. They're still there, still on station, still waiting for the next emergency. But they looked at me, I said. They saw me. She nodded. You were in a restricted area. You didn't have authorization. Of course they noticed. She closed the folder. The question is, are you going to go back? No, I said immediately. Absolutely not. She smiled sadly. That's what everyone says. But some people do. The ones with family connections usually. The ones whose grandfathers or fathers served there. They feel pulled to it. Like they need to report in or say goodbye or something. Most of them only go once. A few go back multiple times. And a very few... She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. A very few don't come back at all. I haven't been back to Piers End since that night. It's been almost a year now, but I think about it constantly. I think about those men, still responding to an emergency that ended 60 years ago, still maintaining their posts, still serving even in death. I think about my grandfather, who served with them, who knew what they'd become, who tried to warn me without actually saying the words. And I think about that voice, in the fog, asking for authorization. Because that's what they need, isn't it? Permission. A reason. Authorization to stand down, maybe. Or authorization to acknowledge that someone from the outside world can see them. I haven't gone back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about walking out to that pier again. About calling out to them, telling them who I am, whose grandson I am. About telling them they can rest, that their duty is done, that the Bay remembers what they did and honors it. But I don't know if that's what they need to hear. I don't know if they can rest, or if they even want to. Maybe some people hold their posts forever, not because they're trapped, but because that's who they are. Because the uniform and the duty and the brotherhood matter more than the boundary between life and death. My grandfather told me once that the Coast Guard motto is Semper Paratus, always ready. I used to think it just meant being prepared for emergencies. Now I understand it means something deeper. It means being ready always, forever. Beyond death, if necessary. The men at Piers End are still ready, still on duty, still serving in that gray space between the living world and whatever comes after. And Tillamook Bay is safer for it, even if no one wants to admit why. I see fishermen sometimes, the old-timers who've worked these waters for decades. Sometimes when the fog is rolling in and they're tying up their boats at dusk, they'll pause and look toward the end of the pier. They'll nod once, respectful, like acknowledging someone standing watch. Then they'll secure their lines and head home. They know, we all know, but we don't talk about it, not directly. We just stay away from Piers End after dark, especially in November, especially when the fog comes in. We let the old Coast Guard station stand at the end of the pier, condemned and rotting on the outside, but still operational where it matters. Because some duties transcend death. Some men never leave their posts, and some places along the Oregon coast are protected by guardians who've been serving for longer than any living person can remember. My grandfather knew. He tried to tell me in the only way he could. And now I know too. Piers End Coast Guard Station is still active. The men are still on duty. And if you go out there on the wrong night, if you enter their space without authorization, they'll notice. They'll stop whatever eternal emergency they're responding to, and they'll turn to face you. And they'll ask the only question that matters to men who died serving. What is your authorization? I didn't have an answer that night. I still don't. So I stay away, and I remember, and I honor what they did by respecting the boundary they maintain. That's enough. It has to be. If you're drawn to these true Oregon experiences and want to hear more stories from the places where the past refuses to stay buried, subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. Hit that like button if you'll never look at an abandoned Coast Guard station the same way. And remember, some duties are eternal, and some men never stop serving. 7 more disturbing Oregon accounts are waiting for you. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Fort Stevens is just a historical site during the day, but I learned that after sunset, something in those concrete corridors refuses to let go of the past. My name is Kaizen, and I work night security at Fort Stevens State Park near Astoria. It's a decent job, quiet, pays the bills, gives me time to study for my online degree. The park covers about 4,300 acres of coastal forest and beach, but the main attraction is the old military fortifications from World War II. Massive concrete bunkers, gun batteries, underground corridors. Battery Russell is the big one tourists love during the day. After hours, it's my responsibility to make sure nobody's trespassing or vandalizing the historic structures. I've been doing this for 8 months now. The first 7 were completely uneventful. Walk the perimeter, check the locks, make sure no teenagers are partying in the bunkers, file my report. Easy work, boring even. I'd bring my laptop and knock out homework between rounds, listening to podcasts in my truck to pass the time. Everything changed 3 weeks ago. It was a Wednesday night in late October, around 10 p.m. I was doing my second patrol of the evening, walking through Battery Russell with my flashlight and checking the entrances to make sure they were still secured. The battery is this massive concrete structure built in 1904. Thick walls, narrow corridors, gun rooms that once held 2 10-inch disappearing rifles aimed at the Pacific. Now it's empty except for interpretive signs and the occasional bat. The whole complex is surrounded by earthworks, partially buried in the hillside, with multiple entrances leading into the dark interior. I was checking the south entrance when I heard voices. Not close voices. Distant, echoing from somewhere deep inside the battery. My first thought was teenagers. It happens more often than you'd think, despite the locks. Kids find ways in, looking for a place to drink or scare each other. I radioed it in to dispatch, confirmed I was investigating, and headed inside. The corridors of Battery Russell are concrete and steel, narrow and claustrophobic. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The voices were clearer now, multiple people, all male, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. I couldn't make out words yet, but the cadence was strange, too formal, too organized. "Security," I called out. "Park's closed. You need to leave now." The voices stopped instantly. Complete silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just the drip of condensation from the ceiling and my own breathing. "I'm serious," I said louder this time. "This is federal property. You're trespassing. Come out now, or I'm calling the police. Still nothing. I moved deeper into the battery, my flashlight sweeping the corridor. The concrete walls were covered in decades of graffiti and water stains. Empty gun rooms opened to my left and right, their massive artillery mounts long since removed. Everything looked normal, abandoned, cold, empty. Then I smelled it. Cordite, the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder that's just been fired. I stopped walking. That didn't make sense. Nobody had fired anything in this battery since 1944. The smell was impossible. But it was there, unmistakable and strong, mixed with something else. Oil, metal, the smell of machinery in use. The voices started again, suddenly, all at once. Closer this time. I spun toward the sound and saw light spilling from one of the gun rooms ahead. Not flashlight light, but the yellow-orange glow of oil lamps or emergency lighting. I approached slowly, my hand on my radio, ready to call for backup. The voices were distinct now, men shouting coordinates, calling out orders, the organized chaos of people working under pressure. I reached the doorway and looked inside. The room was occupied, not by teenagers, not by vandals, by soldiers. They were dressed in World War II-era uniforms, helmets, canvas gear, the works. There were maybe 8 or 10 of them, moving around a massive artillery piece that absolutely should not have been there. The 10-inch disappearing gun was intact, the equipment was operational, and the men were loading 617-pound shells into the breech with practiced efficiency. One man stood at a table covered in maps and instruments, calling out firing solutions. Another was peering through optical sights, his hand on elevation controls. They were preparing to fire. I stood there, frozen, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. The equipment had been removed decades ago. The room was empty. I'd walked past it 100 times. But now it was fully operational, lit by portable lamps, filled with men who moved with the urgency of active combat. One of them turned and looked directly at me. His face was young, maybe 25, covered in sweat and grime. His eyes locked on mine, and for a second I saw recognition there, acknowledgement that I was standing in the doorway. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He saluted, a sharp, formal military salute held for exactly the right amount of time before dropping. Then he turned back to his work like I wasn't there. "Target sighted," someone shouted. "Distance 4,000 yards, bearing 270. "Load," another voice commanded. The breech clanged shut. The gun elevated, hydraulics hissing, the massive barrel rising toward the ceiling, toward where the gun portal would have been, where it could fire out at the ocean. "Fire!" I didn't hear the shot. Instead, everything went silent and dark all at once, like someone had cut power to reality itself. The light vanished. The voices stopped. The smell of cordite disappeared. I stood in absolute darkness, my flashlight flickering weakly, illuminating nothing but empty concrete walls and an abandoned gun mount covered in rust. The room was empty. Had always been empty. The soldiers were gone. I ran. Didn't walk, didn't investigate further, just turned and sprinted back through those corridors until I burst out into the cold October air. I made it to my truck, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could steady my hands enough to write a report. I didn't mention the soldiers. How could I? I wrote up possible trespassers, investigated, found nothing, and submitted it. My supervisor accepted it without question, just another false alarm. But I knew what I'd seen, and 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, around 10 p.m. Same location, Battery Russell. I was doing my patrol, trying to convince myself the previous incident had been exhaustion or carbon monoxide or something explainable. I wasn't even going to go inside. I was just checking the exterior locks when I heard it. Marching. Multiple sets of boots hitting concrete in perfect synchronization coming from inside the battery. The sound echoed out through the entrances, clear and unmistakable. I stood there, listening as the footsteps grew louder, like a formation of men was marching through the corridors toward the exit. toward me. I backed away from the entrance, my flashlight trained on the dark opening. The marching continued, getting closer, the rhythm never breaking. I could hear equipment rattling, metal canteens, ammunition belts, the distinctive sounds of soldiers in full gear moving together. They never emerged. The marching reached the entrance and simply stopped, like the formation had halted just inside the doorway. I stood there, in the silence, my heart hammering, my flashlight illuminating nothing but darkness and empty concrete. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, instantly. My breath came out in visible clouds, frost forming on the concrete around the entrance. The cold was unnatural, bone deep, like standing next to an open freezer in the middle of summer. And then I heard breathing. Not human breathing, something mechanical and rhythmic, like dozens of lungs working in perfect unison. In and out, the sound of men standing at attention, waiting. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat had closed up completely. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it started, the temperature returned to normal. The frost melted. The breathing stopped. And I was alone again, standing outside an empty battery in the October night. I went straight to my supervisor's office the next morning and told him everything. I expected him to think I was crazy, to laugh it off, or suggest I take a drug test. Instead, he just nodded slowly and closed his office door. "You're not the first," he said. He pulled out a file folder, old and worn, that he kept in a locked drawer. Inside were reports dating back to the 1970s when the fort first became a state park. Security guards, maintenance workers, even some tourists, all describing similar experiences. Voices in the batteries, the smell of gunpowder, soldiers in period uniforms, marching footsteps, temperature drops. "Why didn't you warn me?" I asked. "Because most people never experience it," he said. "Maybe 1 out of every 10 security guards. And the ones who do, they either quit immediately or they figure out how to coexist with it." He leaned back in his chair. Fort Stevens was operational from 1863 to 1947. Generations of soldiers served here. And in June 1942, it was the only military installation in the continental United States to be fired upon by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. I knew that story. A Japanese submarine, I-25, had surfaced offshore and fired 17 shells at the battery. Most missed. A few hit the beach. No casualties. The soldiers manned the guns but were ordered to hold fire, never knowing if the submarine was out of range or if revealing the fort's full capabilities would make them a bigger target. They were on high alert after that, my supervisor continued. Every man stationed here expected another attack, expected invasion. They manned those guns every night, ready to defend. And then, he paused. The war ended. They decommissioned the fort in 1947. The soldiers went home. But something stayed. "That's impossible," I said. "You saw them," he replied simply. "You heard them. You going to tell me it didn't happen?" I couldn't, because it did happen. I knew it did. "What do I do?" I asked. "Your job," he said. "Check the locks. File your reports. If you encounter them again, just leave. Don't interact. Don't challenge them. Don't try to understand it. Just acknowledge they're there and move on." That was 3 weeks ago. I've encountered them 5 more times since then. Not every night, but often enough that I know the pattern now. They're most active between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always in Battery Russell, though I've heard reports of activity in the other batteries too. Always the same scenarios. Loading guns, running drills, marching patrols, maintaining readiness for an attack that never came. Last night was the worst, though. Last night, they spoke directly to me. I was doing my patrol, approaching Battery Russell carefully like I always do now. I heard voices inside, calling out coordinates, the usual activity. I stopped at the entrance, about to turn around and check the other batteries instead when the voices inside changed. They weren't calling coordinates anymore. They were arguing. "Someone's out there again." "How many times now? 8, 10. He keeps coming back. Doesn't he understand? Maybe he can't hear us. Maybe he doesn't know. The voices weren't distant or echoing anymore. They were right there, just inside the entrance, clear as if people were standing in front of me. But when I shined my flashlight through the doorway, there was nothing. Just empty corridor, stretching into darkness. "We can see you," one of the voices said. Calm, matter of fact. "We've been seeing you for weeks now. You come every night, checking our position, observing our readiness." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "We need to know," another voice said. "Are you reconnaissance? Are you testing our defenses? Because we're ready. We're always ready. We haven't abandoned our posts." "I'm not." My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again. "I'm security for the park. I work here." Silence, long and heavy. Then, "What year is it?" The question was so unexpected, so plaintive, that I almost laughed. Almost. 2025, I said. More silence. Then something that might have been a sigh, or might have been whined through the corridors, but sounded too much like grief. 83 years, the voice said quietly. "We've been waiting for 83 years. They told us to hold fire that night, told us to stay ready, told us they'd give the order when it was time. But the order never came. The submarine left. The war ended. Everyone went home. And we're still here, still holding the line, still waiting for orders that will never come." My hands were shaking. "You can rest now. The war's over. You don't have to. We have no orders to stand down." The voice was suddenly sharp, commanding, filled with military authority. "We were told to hold this position, to defend this coast, to be ready, until someone with proper authority tells us otherwise. That's what we do. That's what soldiers do. But there's no one left. Then we wait." Another voice now, younger, desperate. "We wait because that's our duty, because we took an oath, because leaving our posts without orders is desertion, and we're not deserters. We're not." The temperature plummeted again. Frost spread across the concrete, across my boots, creeping up the walls. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. "Please leave," the first voice said, quieter now, almost pleading. "Please stop coming here. Every time you walk these corridors, every time you check our positions, it reminds us. It reminds us we're still here, still waiting, still serving. And it hurts. Whatever we are now, however we exist, it hurts to remember what we're supposed to be defending, what we're supposed to go home to, knowing we never will." The frost retreated. The temperature normalized, and I was alone again, standing outside an empty battery, my flashlight illuminating nothing but concrete and darkness. I haven't been inside Battery Russell since. I still patrol the park, still do my job, but I check that battery from the outside only. Lock the doors, note anything unusual, move on. I report activity when I hear it. Voices, marching, the smell of cordite. But I don't investigate anymore, because they're right. Every time I go in there, I'm reminding them of what they've lost. Every time they see me, they remember they're trapped in a duty that should have ended 80 years ago, defending a coast that hasn't been threatened since 1942, following orders that will never be countermanded. I've started researching military, protocol, historical records, anything that might help, but there's no procedure for releasing soldiers who died before they were officially discharged. No way to give them the stand-down orders they need. Fort Stevens was decommissioned in 1947, the guns removed, the soldiers sent home. But these men, whatever they are, whatever's left of them, they missed that final order. They're still at their posts, still ready, still serving. And I don't know if that's honor or tragedy or both. Fort Stevens is a historical site during the day. Families take photos, kids climb on the old gun mounts, tourists read the interpretive signs. But at night, after the visitors leave and the gates close, part of it is still an active military installation, still defended by men who never got to go home, still waiting for an order that will never come. I think about them every night when I patrol, about duty that transcends death, about soldiers who can't leave because they never learned how, about the cost of service that extends beyond any contract or term of enlistment. And I wonder if someday, somehow, someone will find a way to release them, to give them permission to rest, to tell them their watch is over and they can finally stand down. Until then, I'll keep doing my job. I'll patrol the park, check the batteries, file my reports. And I'll stay out of battery rustle after dark, because those men have earned the right to wait in peace, without constant reminders of what they're waiting for. Some duties never end. Some soldiers never stop serving. And some places along the Oregon coast are protected by guardians who've been holding the line longer than anyone alive can remember. If these real Oregon accounts are keeping you awake at night, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. We have 6 more disturbing stories from Oregon's darkest places waiting for you. Hit that like button if military sacrifice just became a lot more real. And remember, some oaths transcend death itself. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. You'd think getting lost on Highway 101 would be impossible. It's one straight line along the coast. But somehow, for 3 hours, I drove in circles on a road that doesn't curve. My name is Zechariah, and I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing cross-country runs for 12 years now, and I know every major highway in the western states like the back of my hand. I-5, I-84, Highway 97. I've driven them thousands of times in every weather condition, every time of day. The routes are predictable, the distances are fixed, and that's exactly how I like it. No surprises, no variables. Just point A to point B with a load of cargo and a delivery deadline. Highway 101 along the Oregon coast is one of my favorite stretches. It's beautiful during the day. Ocean on one side, forest on the other, little coastal towns scattered along the way. At night, it's quieter, less traffic, easier driving. I've run that route maybe 50 times over the years, usually hauling goods from California up to Washington. It's straightforward. You literally can't get lost. The highway follows the coastline the entire way, and you'd have to actively try to miss your exit. So when I tell you I got lost on Highway 101 for 3 hours in the middle of the night, driving the same section of road over and over despite never turning around, you'll understand why it took me so long to accept what was happening. It started on a Tuesday night in mid-October. I was hauling a load of restaurant equipment from Eugene up to Astoria, scheduled to arrive by 6 a.m. for an early morning delivery. I'd left Eugene around 10 p.m., planning to drive straight through. The route was simple. Take Highway 126 west to the coast, connect to Highway 101 north, follow it all the way to Astoria, maybe 4 hours total, 5 if I stopped for coffee. Everything was normal until I hit the coast. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I merged onto Highway 101 near Florence. The night was clear, no fog, just a sliver of moon over the ocean. My truck was running smooth. Radio was playing classic rock. GPS showed the route highlighted in blue. Standard night drive. I passed through Yachats around midnight, noted the mile marker, 166, and settled in for the long stretch north. The next town of any size would be Newport, maybe 30 miles up. Between Yachats and Newport, there's not much. Just highway, forest, ocean, and the occasional pullout or scenic viewpoint. Perfect for making time. I'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when I passed a distinctive landmark. A rest area with a big carved wooden sign that read Cape Perpetua Scenic Area. I noted it in passing, just another reference point. The road curved gently inland here, following the topography. Thick forest on both sides before it would swing back toward the coast. 10 minutes later, I passed the same sign again. I blinked, glanced at my GPS. It showed me heading north on Highway 101, my blue dot moving steadily along the route. But I'd definitely just passed Cape Perpetua for the second time. The wooden sign was too distinctive to mistake. Carved letters, specific style, illuminated by a spotlight. I shook my head, figuring I'd been spacing out, maybe misjudged the distance. Fatigue playing tricks. I cranked up the radio, rolled down my window for some cold air, and kept driving. 5 minutes later, I passed it again. The same sign. The exact same Cape Perpetua scenic area marker. I slowed down this time, staring at it as I passed. No question, it was the same sign. Same location, same spotlight, same everything. I checked my GPS. Still showing me on Highway 101, still heading north, my position updating normally. But I'd just passed the same landmark 3 times in 20 minutes. I pulled into the next turnout and stopped. My heart was pounding now, that first flutter of real concern. I studied the GPS carefully. According to it, I was about 10 miles north of Yakats, which made sense given the time I'd been driving, but I kept passing Cape Perpetua, which was only about 3 miles south of Yakats. The numbers didn't match the reality. I got out of the truck, walked around, checked my tires, looked for anything unusual. Everything was fine. The night was quiet, just the sound of waves from the invisible ocean beyond the trees. No other vehicles on the road, no lights except my truck, and the distant glow of what I assumed was Yakats to the south. I climbed back in, studied my maps, paper maps, not GPS. Highway 101 was a straight line here, no loops, no alternate routes. You literally couldn't drive in circles unless you turned around, which I definitely hadn't done. I decided to keep going, pay closer attention. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. Maybe I'd missed a detail. I pulled back onto the highway and drove north, watching my odometer, counting the tenths of miles. 3.4 miles later, I passed the Cape Perpetua sign again. This time I slammed on the brakes right there on the highway, bringing 18 tons of truck and cargo to a halt in the middle of the road. No other vehicles behind me, no headlights in either direction. I sat there in the silence, engine idling, staring at that carved wooden sign in my headlights. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a mistake. Something was fundamentally wrong. I checked everything. Odometer was advancing normally. GPS was updating. The clock on my dashboard was moving forward. It was now 12:47 a.m. I'd been on this stretch of road for over an hour, should be halfway to Newport by now. But I kept passing the same landmark over and over. My fuel gauge caught my attention. It had dropped from 3/4 to just over half. That wasn't right. I should have used maybe 1/8 of a tank, but I'd burned through 1/4. The truck was consuming fuel normally, but I wasn't making any progress. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Normal for this stretch of coast. I tried the CB radio. Static. I called out on the emergency channel, asking if anyone could hear me, if anyone was experiencing anything unusual. Nothing but empty static in response. The highway stretched ahead of me in my headlights. Black asphalt, yellow center line, dense forest on both sides. Behind me, the same. No vehicles, no lights, no people. Just me and this impossible situation. I started driving again slowly now, watching everything. The painted lines on the road, the reflective markers, the mile markers. I passed mile marker 168, then 169, then nothing. The next marker I saw was 168 again. The road wasn't looping, it was resetting. I tried turning around, put the truck in a careful 3-point turn, which is tricky with a loaded semi, but I managed, and headed south. I'd drive back to Yachats, stop, figure this out with clear mind and better light. Get off this stretch of highway entirely. 10 minutes of driving south, I passed the Cape Perpetua sign heading the opposite direction. 5 minutes later, I passed it again. Still heading south. Still seeing the same landmark. The road had me, and it wasn't letting go. I've heard stories from other drivers over the years. Late-night conversations at truck stops. The kind of stories people share when they're tired and wired on coffee and looking for something to pass the time. Ghost highways. Phantom intersections. Stretches of road that don't appear on maps, but somehow you end up on them. Most drivers laugh these off. I always did too. Superstition, fatigue, misremembering. But now I was living it. I stopped the truck again, this time in the middle of a straight section with good visibility in both directions. I needed to think. The clock showed 1:23 a.m. I'd been on the stretch of Highway 101 for nearly 2 hours. I should be in Newport by now, maybe even past it. Instead, I was trapped in a loop that shouldn't exist, watching my fuel gauge drop, my delivery deadline approaching with no way to explain what was happening. That's when I saw the other vehicle. Headlights behind me, coming up fast. The first vehicle I'd seen since this started. Relief flooded through me. Another driver. Someone who could confirm I wasn't going insane. Someone who maybe knew what was happening or could help. The vehicle approached, slowed, as it got close to my truck. I could see it in my mirrors. A sedan, older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. It pulled alongside me in the opposite lane and stopped. I rolled down my window. The driver's side window of the sedan was already down, but there was no one inside. The car was empty. Driver's seat, passenger seat, both vacant. But the engine was running, the headlights were on, and it had just driven up behind me and pulled alongside like someone was at the wheel. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The car sat there idling next to my truck, perfectly still, perfectly empty. Then, slowly, it started rolling forward. Not accelerating, just rolling at maybe 10 miles per hour, keeping a pace with nothing, driving itself. It passed my truck and continued north up Highway 101, taillights fading into the darkness. I sat there, both hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. That wasn't exhaustion. That wasn't stress. That was real. That car had no driver, and it had just passed me and driven away. My radio crackled. Not the CB, my regular FM radio. The classic rock station I'd been listening to earlier cut out, replaced by static. Then, through the static, I heard something. Voices. Faint and distant, and speaking in what sounded like overlapping conversations, like I was listening to multiple radio transmissions at once. Lost on the 101. Keep passing the same. Can't get out. Been driving for hours. Please, someone help. The voices weren't current. They had that hollow, recorded quality of old audio. And they were all saying variations of the same thing. People lost on Highway 101, unable to escape, driving in loops. How many people? How long had this been happening? The radio cut back to static, then silence, then back to the classic rock station like nothing had happened. Like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I know what I heard. I started driving north again because I didn't know what else to do. South wasn't working. Stopping wasn't helping. Maybe if I kept going long enough, something would change. Some variable would shift. Some element of this loop would break. I passed Cape Perpetua again. Mile marker 168 again. The empty sedan was ahead of me now, still driving itself, taillights visible in the distance. I followed it, keeping it in sight, irrationally hoping that it knew something I didn't, that it was driving toward some exit I couldn't see. The sedan's brake lights came on. It slowed, pulled into a scenic viewpoint on the ocean side of the highway, and stopped. Its headlights shut off. The engine went silent, and then nothing. Just a dark, empty car sitting in an empty parking area. I drove past, watching it in my mirrors. No movement, no lights, just an abandoned vehicle in a pullout. 2 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me again. The same sedan, driving itself, coming up fast to overtake me again. The loop wasn't just spatial, it was temporal. Events were resetting. The car was resetting. And I was still trapped in it, burning fuel, burning time, getting nowhere. I looked at my fuel gauge. Just under a quarter tank now. In another hour, maybe less, I'd run out of diesel. And then what? Sit here in a dead truck on a looping highway that doesn't exist, waiting for sunrise that might never come. The thought terrified me more than anything else. Not the empty car, or the voices on the radio, or the impossible geometry of the road. The thought of being stranded here, fuel gone, unable to move, trapped in this loop forever. I pushed the accelerator, speeding up to 60, then 70. Speed limits didn't matter anymore. Getting out mattered. The truck responded, engine roaring, the loaded trailer staying stable behind me. I watched the speedometer, the road, the landmarks. Cape Perpetua sign, passed it doing 70. 3 minutes later, passed it again. Mile marker 168, 169, 168 again. The sedan overtook me, empty driver's seat visible in my headlights, passed me like I was standing still, and then, finally, something different. A light ahead, off to the right side of the highway. Not headlights, a stationary light. White and bright and steady. A building, maybe, or a house. The first new element I'd seen in hours. I slowed down as I approached. It was a building, small, looked like a ranger station or information center. The kind of place you'd stop during the day for trail maps and bathroom breaks. It was closed, obviously, but there was a light on inside, visible through the windows. And there was a person. A figure standing at the window, looking out. I couldn't see details, just a silhouette backlit by the interior light. But it was definitely a person, the first human being I'd seen since entering this loop. I pulled into the parking area, set my brakes, left the engine running, got out of the truck, legs stiff from hours of sitting. The night air was cold and smelled like ocean salt and pine. The building was maybe 30 feet away, the figure still visible in the window. I walked toward it, my boots loud on the gravel parking lot. As I got closer, I could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman, maybe middle-aged, wearing what looked like a Park Service uniform. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the window, facing me. I reached the door, locked. I knocked. "Hello? I need help. I'm stuck." The figure at the window didn't move, didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice I was there. I walked around to the window where she stood, got close enough to see her face. She was staring straight ahead with eyes that didn't blink, didn't focus, didn't see. Her skin looked waxy, artificial. And then I realized it wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, a display figure, probably part of some educational exhibit. The light inside wasn't electricity. It was moonlight, reflecting off glass panels in some strange way that made it look like interior lighting. I backed away from the building, back to my truck. Another false hope, another empty promise of help. The clock on my dashboard showed 3:17 a.m. I'd been trapped for nearly 4 hours. My delivery was impossible now. Even if I escaped this instant, I'd miss my window. But that didn't matter. What mattered was getting out, getting free, getting back to a world where roads went somewhere and cars had drivers, and time moved forward properly. I started driving again, north, because that's what I'd been doing and I didn't know what else to try. Cape Perpetua sign, mile marker 168. The empty sedan passing me. All of it familiar now, almost routine, this impossible loop becoming its own kind of normal. My fuel gauge hit the red zone. Maybe 15 minutes of diesel left, maybe 20. Then I'd be stranded. The first hint of dawn started to show on the eastern horizon. Just a faint lightening of the sky, but it was something. Time was still passing in the real world, even if I was stuck in this pocket dimension or loop or whatever it was. Sunrise was coming. And as that light increased, I noticed something change. The landmarks looked different. Not the signs. Those were the same. But the forest. The texture of the darkness between the trees. It was thinning somehow, becoming less dense, less complete. I passed Cape Perpetua again, but this time, just beyond it, I saw another mile marker. 167. Going south, which was wrong because I was heading north. But it was there. A new marker. A break in the pattern. I kept driving, accelerating, my fuel gauge bouncing at the bottom of the red. The sky continued to brighten. True dawn now, not just a hint. And the road started to feel real again. Solid, fixed, connected to the world. I passed through a curve I'd driven a dozen times that night. But this time when I came out of it, there was a sign. Newport, 15 miles. Newport, a real town, a destination. I wasn't looping anymore. The road opened up and I could see the ocean to my west, gray and vast in the dawn light. Normal. Real. The GPS on my dashboard suddenly updated with a surge of data, recalculating, announcing I was on Highway 101 north of Waldport, which made no sense given my timeline, but at least it was tracking reality again. I drove straight to Newport, pulled into the first gas station I found, and filled up my tank with shaking hands. The fuel pump was real. The station attendant who took my credit card was real. The sun rising over the coastal hills was real. I was out. I sat in my truck at that gas station for an hour, drinking terrible coffee and trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I called my dispatch, explained I'd missed my delivery window due to mechanical issues, arranged for the load to be dropped later that day. They weren't happy, but they dealt with it. That's business. But I couldn't deal with it. Not mentally, not emotionally. I'd lost 4 hours to a loop that shouldn't exist, on a road I'd driven dozens of times with no explanation and no warning. I've driven Highway 101 since then, during daylight, with another driver, never alone, never at night. And I always watch my fuel gauge on that stretch between Yachats and Newport, because I know now that if you get caught in the loop with an empty tank, you might never leave. Other drivers have asked me about that night. Word gets around in the trucking community. Someone goes missing for hours, shows up confused and shaken. There are questions. I don't tell them much. Just that I got disoriented, took a wrong turn somehow. They accept it because they've all had strange nights on the road. But I know the truth. Highway 101 has a loop in it. Not on any map, not marked by any sign. But it's there. A stretch of road that repeats itself, that traps drivers in temporal and spatial impossibility, that burns your fuel while taking you nowhere. I don't know why it exists. I don't know if it's always there or only appears sometimes. I don't know if the empty sedan is still driving itself through that loop, or if the voices on the radio are people still trapped there, their transmissions echoing across time. What I know is this. If you're ever driving Highway 101 late at night and you pass the same landmark twice, don't ignore it. Don't convince yourself you're tired or mistaken. Turn around immediately. Get off that section of highway. Drive to the nearest town and wait for daylight. Because some roads don't lead anywhere. They just loop forever, consuming time and fuel and hope, until you're as empty as that sedan and as lost as those voices on the radio. And I don't know if everyone who enters that loop makes it out. If you're still watching and these true Oregon stories are messing with your sense of reality, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. We have 5 more disturbing accounts from Oregon's darkest roads and forgotten places. Hit that like button if you'll never look at Highway 101 the same way. And remember, some roads take you places you were never meant to go. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. I didn't believe in ghosts until one touched me. The burn mark on my arm is 3 years old now, and it still hasn't faded. My name is Darian, and I'm a college student at the University of Oregon. I'm studying environmental science, which means a lot of field work, a lot of hiking, and a lot of time outdoors. I love it. Grew up in suburbs outside Portland. Spent my whole childhood wanting to be anywhere but concrete and strip malls. Eugene was perfect for me, close enough to forests and rivers and mountains that I could scratch that itch for wilderness whenever I needed. The Eugene Pioneer Cemetery sits right in the middle of the city, bordered by the university campus on one side and residential neighborhoods on the other. It's one of those places you pass every day without really seeing it. Old headstones, towering oak trees, well-maintained paths. During the day, it's almost peaceful, a pocket of history surrounded by modern development. Students cut through it as a shortcut between campus and downtown. Joggers use the paths. It's public space, open from dawn to dusk. I'd walked through that cemetery maybe 50 times over my 3 years at U of O. Never at night, though. The gates close at sunset, and while they're not locked, just ceremonially closed, there's an understanding that you don't go in after dark. Respect for the dead, respect for the neighbors, whatever. I'd never had a reason to break that unwritten rule. Until the night of November 14th, 3 years ago. I was coming back from a study group that ran late, around 10:30 p.m. My apartment was on the far side of downtown, and the normal route would take me about 30 minutes on foot. But I had an exam at 8 a.m. I was exhausted, and I still had notes to review before sleeping. The cemetery offered a straight shot that would cut 15 minutes off my walk. 15 minutes I desperately needed. I stood at the south entrance, looking at those ceremonially closed gates. The cemetery was dark, lit only by ambient light from the surrounding streets and the half-moon overhead. The old-growth oaks cast long shadows across the headstones. Everything was still. Just a cemetery, I told myself. Just grass and stone and trees. Nothing supernatural, nothing dangerous. And I needed those 15 minutes. I pushed open the gate. It swung easily, silently, and stepped inside. The air felt different immediately. Not colder, just heavier somehow, like the atmosphere had more weight to it. The sounds from the street behind me faded unnaturally fast, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate. My footsteps on the path sounded too loud, echoing in a way they shouldn't in an open space. The headstones were mostly old, dating back to the 1850s and 60s. Eugene's founders, pioneers who'd crossed the Oregon Trail, their wives and children. Some of the markers were elaborate. Carved angels, ornate crosses, family monuments. Others were simple stone slabs, names and dates barely visible after 150 years of weather. I was about a third of the way through when I first saw her. A figure in white, standing near a cluster of old-growth oaks on the eastern edge of the cemetery. Not walking, not moving, just standing there among the trees. At first I thought it was just a trick of moonlight on a marble monument, but as I kept walking, I realized it was a person. A woman in what looked like a long white dress or gown. My first thought was another student, someone else cutting through. But something about the way she stood was wrong. Too still, too formal. Like a statue, not a living person. I should have turned around, should have taken the long way. But I was curious and stupid and 20 years old. I kept walking, angling slightly toward her to see better. She was facing away from me, toward the trees. Her dress, I could see it more clearly now, was old-fashioned, something from the 1800s, with long sleeves and a high collar. Her hair was dark, pulled back into a style I'd only seen in historical photos. And she was floating, not obviously, just a few inches off the ground, subtle enough that I almost missed it. But there was a gap between her feet and the grass, a space that shouldn't exist. I stopped walking. My heart was pounding now, that primal recognition that something is deeply fundamentally wrong. The air felt heavier here, pressing against my chest. The woman turned around. Her face was young, maybe 25, but the expression on it was ancient with grief. Eyes that looked like they'd been crying for years. Skin pale, not just pale but luminous, lit from within by some source that wasn't the moon. She looked directly at me, and I felt that gaze like a physical weight. And then she started moving toward me. Not walking. Gliding. Feet never touching the ground. The white dress flowing around her like she was underwater. She moved fast, covering the distance between us in seconds, and I was frozen, unable to move, unable to run, unable to do anything but stand there as she approached. She stopped right in front of me, close enough to touch. I could see details now. The fabric of her dress was old, genuinely old, with that texture of cloth that's been preserved for over a century. There was an odor, too, faint but distinct. Old paper, and flowers, and something else, something like earth. Her lips moved. She was speaking, or trying to, but I couldn't hear words. just a whisper of sound, like wind through dead leaves. Her hand reached out toward me, fingers extended, and I saw her mouth form a single word that might have been, "please." And then she touched my arm. The sensation was instant and overwhelming. Not cold. Heat. Searing, impossible heat, like touching a branding iron fresh from the forge. Pain flared up my arm, brilliant and shocking, radiating from the point of contact. I screamed and stumbled backward, and she dissolved, not faded. Dissolved, like smoke caught in a sudden wind, there and then not there, present, and then absent. I looked down at my arm. Where she'd touched me, above my left wrist, my skin was red and blistering. The fabric of my jacket sleeve was singed, burned through in the exact shape of a hand. Underneath, my flesh was already forming blisters, the kind you get from severe burns. The pain was incredible, worse than any burn I'd ever experienced. It felt like the heat was still there, still radiating from that spot, cooking my flesh from the inside out. I ran. Forgot about being tired, forgot about the exam, forgot about everything except getting out of that cemetery as fast as possible. I sprinted down the path, crashed through the north gate, and didn't stop until I was on a well-lit street with cars and people and signs of normal life. I went straight to the emergency room at Sacred Heart Medical Center. Told them I'd had an accident with a camping stove, which was the only explanation I could think of for a burn this severe. The doctor who examined me looked confused. The injury was localized to a very specific area, a perfect handprint above my wrist, which didn't match the pattern of any cooking accident. But they treated it anyway, cleaned and bandaged the burn, gave me pain medication and antibiotics to prevent infection, told me to watch for signs of second-degree damage. The burn healed over the next few weeks, but it left a scar. A white mark on my arm in the exact shape of a hand, 4 fingers and a thumb, clear as a brand. The tissue is different there, smooth, almost waxy, like burn scars get when they've healed completely. I couldn't let it go. I had to know what I'd seen, what had touched me, so I started researching. The Eugene Pioneer Cemetery has records, maintained by the local historical society and available online. Death certificates, burial locations, plot maps. I searched for women who died young in the 1800s, particularly those buried near the old-growth oaks on the eastern edge. I found her. Her name was on a headstone I'd walked past that night without seeing. Born in 1843 in Missouri. Died in Eugene in 1868 at age 25. The death certificate listed the cause, complications from childbirth. The baby had died too, just 3 days old. They were buried together in the same plot, under those oak trees. The records had more details. She'd been married to a local mill owner. They'd moved to Eugene in 1865, part of the wave of settlement after the Donation Land Claim Act. She'd been pregnant twice before. Both children had died in infancy, a common tragedy in that era. The third pregnancy seemed healthy, but something went wrong during delivery. She died of hemorrhaging, and the baby, a girl, died shortly after of what the records called failure to thrive. Her name was written on the headstone. I won't repeat it here. That feels like a violation somehow, like using someone's real name in a ghost story. But I know it. I've stood at that grave marker and read it a dozen times. I kept researching. Cemetery, records, old newspaper archives, anything I could find about the Pioneer Cemetery and its history. And I found stories. Not official records. Personal accounts, passed down through families or mentioned in private diaries. Stories of people who'd seen a woman in white near those oak trees. Always at night. Always in the eastern section of the cemetery. Sometimes she was crying. Sometimes she was just standing there, looking toward the graves. Sometimes she reached out to people. The earliest account I found was from 1872, just 4 years after her death. A man walking home late at night cut through the cemetery and saw her. He described her exact appearance: white dress, dark hair, floating above the ground. He ran, like I did. Another account from 1903. A couple leaving a party used the cemetery as a shortcut. The woman saw her and fainted. Her husband had to carry her out. 1928. A group of teenagers dared each other to go into the cemetery at midnight. One of them saw her and refused to talk about what happened for the rest of his life. 1954. A night watchman for the city reported seeing her multiple times during his rounds. He eventually requested reassignment. The most recent account I found before mine was from 2018. A student at U of O cut through the cemetery at night and encountered her. That student described the same thing: the floating, the reaching out. But that student had run before she could touch them. I was the first one I could find who'd actually been touched and documented it. I went back to the cemetery during the day multiple times, always in full daylight, always with other people around. I found her grave and stood there, trying to understand. What did she want? Why was she still there? Was she looking for her children? Was she trying to tell someone something? Was she even aware that she was dead, or was she trapped in some moment from her life, replaying it over and over? The headstone was simple: her name, her dates, and a single line of inscription: taken too soon, forever remembered. But was she remembered? By 2021, everyone who'd known her in life had been dead for over a century. Her husband, her family, her friends, all gone. The mill where her husband had worked was long demolished. The house where she'd lived was probably buried under modern development. She'd been forgotten by history, reduced to a name on a stone marker that most people walked past without reading. Except she wasn't gone. She was still there, still waiting, still trying to reach out to someone, something, anything. I tried to find out more about her life. Census records showed she'd come to Oregon from Missouri, married in 1863, listed as a housewife in the 1865 Oregon census. No occupation, no personal details beyond name and age. Just another woman whose life was defined entirely by her relationship to her husband and her children. I found a note in an old church record, the First Baptist Church of Eugene, which existed in the 1860s. She'd been a member. She'd sung in the choir. After her second child died, she stopped attending regularly, according to the church records. The pastor had visited her several times, noted that she was suffering from melancholy, what we'd call depression now. She'd lost 2 children before the one that killed her. That grief had been building for years. And then, when she had a chance at a 3rd child, at maybe finally having something work out, she and the baby both died. That's what I saw in her face that night. Not just grief, desperation, the need to connect with someone, to be acknowledged, to be seen as something other than a name on stone. And when she touched me, when she made that contact, that's what left the scar. Not cold like you'd expect from a ghost. Heat, burning heat. The intensity of that need, that decades of longing compressed into a single touch, manifesting as fire rather than ice. I haven't been back to the cemetery at night since. I walk the long way around, even when I'm tired, even when it costs me time, because I know now that she's there, and I know what her touch feels like. And I know that next time I might not be able to pull away, but I think about her a lot. I think about how many people die with unfinished business, with grief so profound it leaves an imprint on reality. I think about how many places have their own version of her, spirits trapped by loss, by tragedy, by the simple fact that they died before they were ready. The Eugene Pioneer Cemetery is full of graves like hers, young people who died of disease, of childbirth, of accidents, whole families wiped out by typhoid or cholera, children who never made it past infancy. Every headstone is a story of loss, a life cut short, a family left grieving. And maybe some of them are still there, still waiting, still trying to reach out. I look at the scar on my arm every day. It's faded over 3 years, but it's still visible. A permanent reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand, layers of reality we don't normally perceive. That sometimes, in certain places, at certain times, the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thin enough to cross. And when that happens, the touch doesn't always come as cold. Sometimes it burns. Sometimes grief manifests as fire, as heat that sears itself into flesh and leaves marks that never fully heal. I tell people the scar is from a camping accident, or a kitchen burn, or a weird birthmark. I don't tell them the truth. How could I? How could I explain that I was touched by a ghost and it left physical evidence, that I carry proof of the afterlife on my left arm in the shape of a woman's hand who died 157 years ago? But I'm telling you now. I'm telling this story because I think people need to know. The Eugene Pioneer Cemetery isn't just a historical site. It's not just a shortcut through downtown. It's a place where the past isn't quite finished, where some people are still waiting, still trying to be heard. If you're ever in Eugene, if you ever walk past that cemetery, take a moment to read some of the headstones. Remember the names. Acknowledge that these were real people with real lives and real grief. Maybe that's all some of them need, to be remembered, to be seen, to know that their suffering mattered to someone. And for God's sake, don't cut through at night. The 15 minutes you save isn't worth what you might encounter, isn't worth the burn and the grief and the touch that leaves scars that never fully heal. I learned that lesson the hard way. I carry the proof with me every day. And every time I see that white mark on my arm, I remember her face, young and desperate and so profoundly sad. And I whisper her name just to make sure someone still remembers. Because maybe that's what ghosts need. Not exorcism, not investigation, not proof of the paranormal. Just acknowledgement. Just someone to say, I see you. I know you existed. Your grief was real. I hope it helps. I hope wherever she is, in whatever state of being she exists, she knows that someone finally understood what she was trying to say. If you're still watching and these true organ stories are changing how you see the world around you, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. We have 4 more disturbing accounts from places where the past refuses to stay buried. Hit that like button if you'll never look at old cemeteries the same way, and remember, some grief is so profound it burns itself into the world forever. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. They found my kayak 3 days after I disappeared. What they didn't find was any explanation for why I came back. My name is Salvatore, and I need to tell you what happened on the Willamette River in September, because nobody else can explain it, and I'm tired of pretending I understand. I'm a kayaker, been paddling since I was 12, started with lazy weekend floats with friends, and progressed to more challenging runs. Whitewater, river surfing, multi-day trips. By the time I was 28, I'd logged thousands of miles on Oregon rivers. The Deschutes, the Mackenzie, the Rogue, I knew them all. The Willamette was my home river. I lived in Salem, worked as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic, and most evenings I'd hit the water after my shift. Just a peaceful paddle, watching the sun set over the valley, letting the stress of the day wash away with the current. The Willamette through Salem isn't particularly challenging. Gentle class in water, wide and calm, good for beginners. I could paddle it with my eyes closed. That's probably why I didn't take it seriously enough. It was a Thursday evening, September 12th, around 6 p.m. I'd had a long day, back-to-back appointments, a difficult patient who wasn't responding to treatment, paperwork piling up. I needed the river, needed the rhythm of paddling, the sound of water against the hull, that floating meditation that cleared my head. I loaded my kayak onto my truck and drove to Minto Brown Island Park, my usual put-in spot. The park was mostly empty. A few dog walkers, some joggers on the trails, but the boat ramp was clear. Perfect. I unloaded, did my safety check, PFD secured, paddle intact, spray skirt ready, and pushed off into the current around 6:30. The evening was beautiful. Late summer in the Willamette Valley, warm but not hot. The kind of golden light that makes everything look like a painting. The river was running clear, maybe 3 feet of visibility, moving at a comfortable pace. I settled into my stroke, feeling the tension in my shoulders release with each pull of the paddle. I planned to do my usual route, downstream about 3 miles, then turn around and paddle back upstream for the workout. Round trip would take maybe an hour and a half, get me back to the ramp before full dark. Simple, safe, routine. I was about a mile into the paddle when I noticed the birds. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Crows mostly, but other species too. They were flying in circles above a section of the river ahead of me, creating this massive, swirling cloud of black wings. The noise was incredible, a cacophony of caws and shrieks that echoed across the water. I'd seen crow gatherings before. They roost communally sometimes, especially in fall. But this was different. The pattern was too organized, too deliberate. They weren't settling down to roost. They were circling, maintaining this perfect spiral formation above one specific spot on the river. I should have turned around. Every instinct I had said, "Go back. This is wrong. Don't paddle into whatever's causing this." But curiosity won. I told myself it was probably just a dead fish or something, drawing scavengers. I kept paddling toward the bird vortex. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The water was changing. The current, which had been flowing steadily downstream, was starting to swirl. Not dramatically, just little eddies and whirlpools forming in patterns that didn't match the riverbed. And the temperature dropped. I could feel it through the hull of the kayak, cold rising from below. The bird's noise reached a crescendo as I approached. The spiral tightened, concentrating above a point maybe 30 yards ahead of me. And then, all at once, they went silent. Hundreds of birds circling overhead, and suddenly not a sound. Just the slap of my paddle against water and my own breathing. The silence was worse than the noise. I stopped paddling, letting momentum carry me forward. The kayak drifted into the area beneath the birds, and I felt it. A pull, not from the current, from below, like something massive was creating suction underneath me, trying to drag the kayak down. I dug my paddle in hard, trying to stroke backward, to reverse out of whatever this was. But the pull was too strong. My kayak started spinning, caught in a whirlpool that absolutely shouldn't exist in this flat, calm section of river. The water around me began to churn, white and foamy, and I realized I was in serious trouble. This wasn't natural. The Willamette doesn't have whirlpools, doesn't have hydraulics strong enough to trap a kayak. But I was trapped, spinning faster, the bow of my boat tilting down as something pulled from beneath. I tried to paddle out, tried every technique I knew, forward stroke, reverse stroke, brace stroke. Nothing worked. The kayak was being drawn down, the stern lifting, water starting to pour over the bow. I was going vertical, going under, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My last clear thought was to grab a breath before submersion. I filled my lungs, yanked my spray skirt, and kicked free of the kayak as it went under. The water was ice cold, shocking against my skin despite the warm evening. I kicked hard toward the surface, toward light and air, but I didn't go up. I went down. Something had me. Not physically grabbing. There were no hands, no tentacles, nothing I could fight against. But the water itself was pulling me deeper, like I'd been caught in an undertow that defied all physics. I fought against it, swimming hard, burning through the air in my lungs, panic flooding my system. The river bottom came up fast, silty mud and rocks, tangled with submerged branches. I hit it hard, hands sinking into soft sediment. And then I felt it. Pressure. Massive, overwhelming pressure, like the entire weight of the river was focused on me, pushing me down, holding me against the bottom. My vision started to narrow, black edges creeping in, lungs screaming for air. I clawed at the mud, trying to find purchase, trying to push myself up, but the pressure increased, and I realized with absolute clarity that I was going to die here. 28 years old, drowning in a river I'd paddled 100 times, held down by something that couldn't exist. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was on the riverbank, not near where I'd gone under. Miles away, based on what I could see. It was still Thursday evening. The light was the same, the temperature unchanged. But I was downstream, lying in mud and grass on the eastern shore, coughing up river water, my lungs burning. I sat up slowly, checking myself for injuries. Nothing. No cuts, no bruises, no broken bones. My PFD was still on, secured exactly as I'd worn it. My clothes were soaked but intact. I was alive and apparently unharmed, despite having just drowned in deep water. I looked at my watch, 7:15 p.m. I'd gone under around 6:45. Half an hour. I'd been underwater for half an hour and somehow I was fine, breathing, conscious, alive. That's impossible. A person can't survive 30 minutes of submersion. Brain damage starts after 4 minutes without oxygen. Death follows shortly after. But I was here, thinking clearly, moving normally, with no explanation for how. I stood up, trying to orient myself. I recognized the area. I was near Kaiser, about 4 miles downstream from where I'd capsized. 4 miles in 30 minutes. The current wasn't fast enough to carry a body that far in that time, especially not against the drag of a PFD. Nothing about this made sense. I checked my pockets. My phone was gone, lost to the river. My car keys were still clipped to my PFD. I started walking upstream along the bank, heading back toward Minto Brown, trying to process what had happened. It took me 2 hours to walk back. By the time I reached the park, it was after 9 p.m., full dark. My truck was still there, one of the only vehicles in the parking lot. I found an emergency phone at the boat ramp and called 911, reported a kayaking accident, told them I was safe, but my boat was gone. The dispatcher asked questions I couldn't answer. What happened? I don't know. How did you survive? I don't know. Where's your kayak? Somewhere in the river. Are you injured? No. Do you need medical attention? Maybe. I don't know. They sent an ambulance anyway. The EMTs checked me over. Vitals normal, lungs clear, no signs of near drowning. They looked confused. People who nearly drown don't walk away with clear lungs and normal oxygen levels. But I did. The police took a report. I told them the truth. I capsized, went under, blacked out, woke up downstream. I left out the parts about the birds and the impossible whirlpool and the pressure holding me down. Those details would have sounded insane. Maybe they were insane. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. They found my kayak 3 days later, washed up on a gravel bar near Wheatland Ferry, about 12 miles downstream from where I'd gone under. It was intact, undamaged, just wet and empty. My paddle was never recovered. I went back to work the following week, saw patients, did treatments, acted normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 30 minutes, about what happened while I was under, what I can't remember. Because here's the thing, I should remember drowning. I should remember the panic, the pain, the moment my lungs filled with water. But I don't. There's just a gap, dark water, then waking up on the bank. What happened in between? I started researching. Cases of prolonged submersion with survival. Most of them involve the cold water. Ice fishing accidents where hypothermia slows the metabolism enough that the brain can survive longer without oxygen. But the Willamette in September isn't cold water. It's too warm for that kind of protection. I found stories, though. Not medical cases. Folk stories. Accounts from the Kalapuya people who lived in the Willamette Valley for thousands of years before European settlement. They had legends about the river, about spirits that lived in deep pools, about people who drowned and came back changed. One story in particular caught my attention. It described a being called the Water Person, a spirit that pulled people under, held them in the depths, and sometimes released them. Those who came back were marked, the story said. They belonged to the river in some way after that. They were never quite the same. I don't know if I believe in spirits. I'm a scientist, a medical professional. I deal in anatomy and physiology and evidence-based treatment, but I also can't explain what happened to me with science. Can't explain surviving that long underwater. Can't explain the pressure that held me down. Can't explain why the birds circled that exact spot. What I do know is this. I'm different now. Water feels different against my skin, more aware of me, more responsive. When I shower, when I swim, when I stand in the rain, I feel like the water is paying attention, like it recognizes me. And sometimes late at night I have dreams, not memories. I don't think they're memories, but images. Dark water and deeper darkness, a pressure that isn't hostile, just present, holding me, keeping me, and then releasing me, pushing me toward light and air and the living world. In the dreams, I see something in the depths, not clearly, just a shape, massive and ancient, moving slowly through water, too dark to penetrate. And I feel recognition from it, like it knows me, like it chose me. I haven't kayaked since September, can't bring myself to get back on the water. My boat is in my garage, cleaned and dried, gathering dust. Friends ask when I'm going to paddle again, say I shouldn't let one bad accident stop me. They don't understand. It wasn't an accident. Accidents are random. What happened to me was deliberate. The Willamette took me under, held me, and then let me go. Why? I don't know. What did it want? I don't know. What changed in those 30 minutes? I don't know that either. But I know I'm not the same. I know water recognizes me now in a way it didn't before. And I know that somewhere in the Willamette, in the deep pools and dark currents, something is still there, still waiting, still watching. Sometimes I stand on the riverbank and look at the water flowing past, and I swear I can feel it looking back. Not threatening, not calling me, just acknowledging, like we have an understanding now, the river and I, like I'm marked in some way that only the water can see. They found my kayak 3 days after I disappeared. What they didn't find was any explanation for why I came back, and maybe there isn't one. Maybe some things exist outside the boundaries of science and logic. Maybe the world is stranger than we want to admit, and sometimes we stumble into that strangeness and come back changed. I'm alive. That's what matters, right? I survived when I shouldn't have. I'm breathing and walking and living my life. But I'm also marked. I belong to something now that I didn't belong to before. And I don't know if that mark will ever fade, or if the river will ever let me truly leave. If you paddle the Willamette, be careful. Watch for unusual currents. Pay attention when birds gather. And if you see a whirlpool forming in calm water, don't investigate. Turn around. Get to shore. Because some things in that river are older than the cities on its banks, older than the people who named it, and they don't always let go of what they catch. I learned that the hard way. I carry that knowledge with me every day, along with the certainty that water knows my name now. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can feel it calling me back. If these real Oregon experiences are making you question what you know about the world, you're in exactly the right place. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and become part of our horror family. We have 3 more disturbing accounts from Oregon's rivers and wild places coming your way. Hit that like button if you'll never look at calm water the same way. And remember, some rivers take more than they give. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. The man in the top hat tipped his hat to me through the peephole. That would have been charming, except I was locked in my room, and he'd been dead for 80 years. My name is Jericho, and I'm a software sales consultant. I travel for work constantly, maybe 30 weeks out of the year, bouncing between client sites, conferences, meetings. I've stayed in hundreds of hotels across the Pacific Northwest, chain hotels mostly, the kind where every room looks identical whether you're in Seattle or Sacramento. But occasionally, for special client meetings or when I'm treating myself, I book something with character, something historic. The Columbia Gorge Hotel in Hood River was exactly that kind of place. Built in 1921, perched on cliffs above the Columbia River, with a 207-foot waterfall on the property, it had been called the Waldorf of the West in its heyday. Presidents had stayed there, silent film stars. It had the kind of elegant, old-world atmosphere you couldn't find in a Marriott. I booked room 330 for a 3-night stay in early October. I had client meetings in Hood River on Thursday and Friday, and I figured I'd stay through the weekend, do some hiking in the gorge, enjoy the fall colors. The hotel's website showed beautiful rooms with period furnishings, river views, all the historic charm I was looking for. I checked in on Wednesday evening around 7 p.m. The front desk clerk was friendly, handed me an actual metal key, not a key card, a real key with a heavy brass tag marked 330. That detail pleased me. It felt authentic, like staying in a piece of history. Room 330 was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with vintage wallpaper and old photographs of the hotel's glory days. The room itself was smaller than modern hotel rooms, but beautifully appointed. Antique furniture, a 4-poster bed, thick curtains framing windows that overlooked the river. There was even a small fireplace, though it looked decorative rather than functional. I unpacked, worked for a few hours on my laptop, ordered room service for dinner. Everything was perfect. The kind of night that justified booking a historic hotel instead of the Holiday Inn down the road. I went to bed around 11 p.m., tired from travel, expecting to sleep soundly. I woke to the sound of metal sliding against metal. My eyes opened in darkness. The room was pitch black. I'd drawn the heavy curtains, and no light penetrated from outside. But I could hear it clearly. The distinctive sound of a deadbolt being engaged. Click. Then the rattle of a security chain being slid into place. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to orient myself. My door. Someone was at my door, locking it from the outside. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, 3:17 a.m., and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the door at the far end of the room. The deadbolt was engaged. The chain was in place. Both locks that could only be operated from inside the room were secured, but I hadn't locked them. I'd checked the door before bed. The handle lock was engaged, standard procedure, but I never used deadbolts or chains. They made me claustrophobic, made me feel trapped. I got out of bed, walked to the door in my t-shirt and boxer shorts, phone light leading the way. The deadbolt and chain were definitely locked. I reached out to disengage them, and they wouldn't move. Not stuck. They moved slightly under my hand, the mechanisms working normally, but something was holding them in place. Pressure from the other side, like someone was pressing against the door, keeping the locks engaged. I put my eye to the peephole. A man stood in the hallway directly in front of my door. He was dressed in clothing from another era, a long coat, formal trousers, and a top hat. The hallway lights gave him a slightly washed-out appearance, but I could see details clearly. He was maybe 50 years old, clean-shaven, with sharp features and a slight smile, and he was looking directly at the peephole, directly at me. As I watched, he slowly reached up and tipped his hat. A formal, old-fashioned gesture. His smile widened slightly, and he remained there, standing perfectly still, staring at the door. I stumbled backward, phone clattering to the floor. My heart was hammering now, adrenaline flooding my system. Someone was outside my door at 3 a.m. in period costume, locking me in, smiling at me through the peephole. I grabbed the hotel phone next to the bed. Dead. No dial tone. I picked up my cell phone. No signal. 0 bars, which made no sense because I'd had full LTE coverage all evening. I went back to the door, tried the locks again, still held in place by that invisible pressure. I put my shoulder against the door and pushed. It wouldn't budge. The wood didn't even flex. It felt like pushing against concrete. Through the peephole, the man was still there, still smiling, still tipping his hat, over and over in a slow, deliberate motion. Tip, lower, tip, lower, never breaking eye contact with the peephole. I tried shouting, "Hey, hello? I'm locked in here. Someone help." My voice sounded loud in the small room, but I had no idea if it carried through the door. The man outside didn't react, just continued his mechanical hat tipping. I looked around the room for something to break the locks with. But what was I going to do? Smash antique door hardware with a lamp? Even if I could break the deadbolt, the door itself wouldn't open. Something was holding it closed from outside. I checked the windows. They were the old sash type, and they opened. I'd cracked one earlier for fresh air. But I was 3 stories up, overlooking a steep slope down to the river. There was no balcony, no fire escape, no way out except straight down 50 feet to landscaping and rocks. I was trapped. Locked in a hotel room at 3 a.m. with a man in Victorian clothing standing guard outside my door, smiling like this was all a delightful game. I sat on the bed, phone in hand, trying to think rationally. This was a prank. It had to be. Some kind of elaborate Halloween setup the hotel was running, and I'd been unlucky enough to get chosen for it. Or maybe it was a hidden camera show, and I was being filmed freaking out for someone's YouTube channel. But the locks were real. The immovable door was real, and the man outside, when I looked through the peephole again, he was still there, still performing his endless hat tip, and there was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared fixedly at the peephole with that frozen smile on his face. Hours passed. I checked the peephole obsessively, every 10 minutes, every 5 minutes, eventually every minute. The man never moved from his position, never stopped tipping his hat, never blinked or shifted his weight, or showed any sign of being a living person standing in a hallway for hours. My phone remained at 0 bars. The hotel phone remained dead. The door remained locked from the outside, impossible to open from the inside. At some point, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion, because I woke to daylight filtering through the curtains. I looked at my phone, 8:43 a.m. I'd lost 5.5 hours. I went to the door, heart pounding, put my eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty. Normal morning light, no man in a top hat, no one there at all. I tried the deadbolt. It slid open easily. The chain released without resistance. I turned the handle lock and pulled, and the door swung open smoothly. I stood in the doorway, breathing hard, looking up and down the empty corridor. Everything appeared completely normal. Clean carpet, vintage wallpaper, light fixtures casting warm light. No indication that anything unusual had happened. Then I looked down. On the floor, directly in front of my door, sat an old key. Not a modern hotel key like the one I'd been given at check-in. This was genuinely antique. Ornate brass, tarnished with age, attached to a leather tag that read 330 in faded ink. The style was completely different from current hotel keys, older and more elaborate. I picked it up. The metal was cold, the weight substantial. This wasn't a reproduction. This was an actual artifact, the kind of key hotels used in the 1920s. I should have taken it to the front desk immediately. Should have reported what happened, demanded an explanation, maybe even called the police. But I was so shaken, so desperate to feel normal again, that I just wanted out of that room. I grabbed my belongings, stuffed them in my suitcase without even packing properly, and practically ran down the corridor to the elevator. The front desk clerk, a different person than who'd checked me in, looked surprised when I arrived, asking to check out 2 days early. I made up an excuse about a family emergency, paid for the one night, and got out of there as fast as possible. I kept the key, slipped it in my pocket before leaving, some instinct telling me I'd need it as proof of what happened. It wasn't until I was in my car driving back toward Portland that I started researching on my phone. Columbia Gorge Hotel Hauntings, Room 330 Paranormal Activity, Ghost Sightings, Hood River. What I found made my hands shake so badly I had to pull over. Room 330 was famous. Multiple guests had reported being locked in that room by unseen forces, sometimes finding furniture barricaded against the door from the inside when hotel staff finally gained entry. A woman's ghost supposedly haunted the room, appearing at night, waking guests up, but it was the description of another ghost that stopped my breath. A man in a top hat and formal coat, seen around the hotel entrance and in corridors. Some sources called him the doorman, though the hotel never employed doormen historically. Witnesses described him as friendly, tipping his hat to guests, always smiling. He died in 1929, according to one account, one of the stonemasons who'd worked on the original hotel construction in 1921, who'd stayed on as maintenance staff for years before dying in an accident on the property. No one knew why he still appeared. No one knew why he locked guests into their rooms, or why he stood guard in hallways at 3 a.m. I looked at the antique key in my hand. The brass was tarnished in patterns that suggested genuine age, not artificially aged for effect, but decades of oxidation. The leather tag was cracking, the ink faded almost to illegibility. The hotel had replaced all their keys with modern ones in the 1980s during a major renovation. This key shouldn't exist anymore. It should be in a museum or a historical society archive, not lying on the floor outside room 330, after a night where a dead man stood guard in the hallway. I've never been back to the Columbia Gorge Hotel. Can't bring myself to drive past it, much less stay there again. I still have the key. It's in a box in my closet, wrapped in tissue paper, something I can't throw away, but can't look at without remembering. Friends ask me sometimes about that trip, about why I came back early. I make up stories about bad seafood or work emergencies. I don't tell them about the man in the top hat, about hours spent trapped in a historic hotel room while something dead performed an endless hat tip outside my door. I don't tell them about how, on that last look through the peephole before dawn, the man's expression had changed. The smile was gone. Instead, his mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a laugh. I couldn't tell which. And his eyes, which had stared so fixedly at the peephole all night, were completely black. Not dark brown or shadowed. Black. Empty. Like looking into holes where eyes should be. I stay at chain hotels now. Hilton, Hyatt, even Motel 6 if that's all that's available. Places built after 1990, with electronic key cards and security cameras and nothing resembling character or history. Because history has weight. History leaves impressions, and sometimes those impressions are still walking around, still performing their duties, still locking doors and tipping hats and smiling with empty black eyes at guests who don't understand they've been marked. The Columbia Gorge Hotel is still operating. You can book room 330 right now if you want. The website describes it as a charming historic room with river views. There's no mention of the ghosts. No warning about what might lock you in at 3 a.m. No indication that if you put your eye to the peephole in the dark hours before dawn, you might see something that died almost a century ago still standing duty in that third-floor corridor. The man in the top hat tipped his hat to me through the peephole. And whatever he was, ghost, residual haunting, time slip, echo of the past, he left me a gift. An antique key that shouldn't exist, from a lock system the hotel stopped using 50 years ago. A souvenir from 1929, delivered by hands that have been dead since Hoover was president. I keep it as proof, as a reminder that some hotels are more than buildings. Some history refuses to stay buried, and some doormen never stop working, never stop smiling, never stop locking guests into rooms they shouldn't have booked in the first place. If these true Oregon hotel experiences are making you reconsider your travel plans, you're not alone. Subscribe to Haunted Fears and join our horror family. We have one more disturbing account from Oregon's haunted places coming your way. Hit that like button if you'll never book a historic hotel room again. And remember, some doors lock from the outside for a reason. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. I've ridden solo in forests all over the Pacific Northwest. I've never felt watched before, not like that. Not by something that wanted me to know it was there. My name is Matthias, and I'm a mountain biker. Not competitive. I don't race, don't chase Strava times, don't care about podiums. I ride for the solitude, for the rhythm of pedaling through quiet trails, for those moments when it's just me and the forest and nothing else exists. I've logged thousands of miles on trails across Oregon and Washington over the past decade. Remote single-track, technical descents, long grinding climbs through old growth. I prefer riding alone. Always have. The Tillamook State Forest is one of my regular spots. It's about an hour west of Portland, 364,000 acres of public land with hundreds of miles of trails. Most people know it as the Tillamook Burn, the site of 4 massive wildfires between 1933 and 1951 that burned 355,000 acres of old-growth forest. The area was reforested with 72 million hand-planted seedlings between 1949 and 1972. Now, it's dense second-growth Douglas fir, a uniform forest of trees, all the same age, all growing in rows where the seedlings were planted. There's something eerie about post-burn forests. The trees are too evenly spaced, too uniform in size. The understory is different, thicker in some places, sparse in others, lacking the natural variation of virgin forest. And if you know where to look, you can still find evidence of the burns. Charred stumps, blackened snags, areas where the soil is still stained with ash 70 years later. I went out there on a Saturday in late October for a solo ride. The plan was simple, a 25-mile loop on the Browns Camp trail system, moderately technical, good flow sections, nothing too challenging. I'd ridden it maybe 20 times over the years. I knew every switchback and creek crossing. I started around 10 a.m. from the Rogers Camp trailhead. The weather was perfect, overcast but dry, mid-50s, light breeze. The forest was quiet in that late fall way. Most of the birds already migrated, the summer activity gone. Just the sound of my tires on dirt and my breathing as I climbed. Everything was normal for the first hour. I pushed through the initial climb, hit my rhythm, enjoyed the descent into the Wilson River drainage. Past a few other riders heading the opposite direction, exchanged nods. Standard weekend ride. Around mile 12, I stopped to adjust my rear derailleur. It had been shifting rough all morning, and I could feel it getting worse. I found a wide spot on the trail, leaned my bike against a tree, and crouched down to check the alignment. That's when I noticed the silence. Not peaceful quiet. Absence. The forest had gone completely still. No wind, no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Even the ambient noise you don't notice until it's gone. All of it stopped. I stood up slowly, listening. My ears were ringing from the sudden lack of sound. And then I heard something else. Movement. Something large, moving through the forest parallel to the trail, maybe 30 yards off to my left. I turned toward the sound. The forest there was typical Tillamook regrowth. Dense fir trees in rows, thick salal and Oregon grape in the understory. Not great visibility. I couldn't see what was making the noise, but I could track its movement by the way branches were shifting, the way vegetation was being disturbed. It was pacing me, moving at exactly the same speed I'd been riding, maintaining a consistent distance from the trail. I grabbed my bike and mounted up, suddenly very aware that I was alone on a remote trail, miles from the nearest road. Probably just an elk, I told myself. Big animal, moving through the forest, spooked by a mountain biker. Nothing unusual. I started riding again, picking up my pace. The trail here was relatively flat, good for speed. I shifted into a harder gear and pushed. The thing in the forest accelerated to match me. I could hear it clearly now. Heavy footfalls, branches breaking, the rhythmic sound of something large moving fast through dense vegetation. But it stayed hidden, staying just far enough off the trail that I couldn't get a clear view. I pedaled harder. The trail turned right, following the contour of the slope. The thing in the forest turned with me. maintaining that 30-yard distance, matching my speed perfectly. That's when I caught my first glimpse. Through a gap in the trees, just for a second, I saw it. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet. Dark, but not fur dark. More like shadow dark, like it absorbed light. And the movement was wrong. It wasn't running on 4 legs like an elk. It wasn't running on 2 legs like a person. It was moving in a way that made my brain refuse to process what I was seeing. I stopped looking, focused on the trail ahead, on pedaling, on getting out. The trail map in my head said I was about 7 miles from the trailhead. 7 miles of single track through forest, with something stalking me from the trees. The sound continued, relentless, never falling behind, never getting closer, just maintaining that perfect parallel movement. And I realized with growing horror that it wasn't trying to catch me. It was hurting me, keeping me on the trail, making sure I didn't veer off, controlling my movement through its presence. I hit a technical section, rocky descent, tight switchbacks, required focus. I had to slow down, had to pick my line carefully. The thing in the forest slowed to match me. I could hear it clearly now, so close that I could hear its breathing. Not animal breathing, something else. Rhythmic and mechanical, like bellows working. Another glimpse through the trees. Taller than before, or closer, I couldn't tell. And I saw limbs. Too many limbs, or limbs in wrong places, or something my brain interpreted as limbs but couldn't reconcile with any anatomy I knew. My hands were shaking on the handlebars. I nearly wiped out on a root, caught myself at the last second. Focus. Just focus on the trail. Don't look. Don't think. Just ride. The trail climbed again, a punishing grade that had my legs burning and my lungs screaming. I downshifted, grinding upward, sweat pouring despite the cool air. The thing climbed with me, effortlessly, its breathing never changing pace. And then, finally, I crested the ridge and saw it ahead, the gravel road that led back to the trailhead. Pavement. Civilization. The boundary. The thing in the forest stopped. I didn't stop pedaling. I hit that gravel road at full speed, bike bouncing over the rough surface, not caring about my suspension or my tires or anything except putting distance between me and those trees. I rode the 2 miles of gravel road back to the parking area, expecting at any second to hear that sound again, to feel that presence. But it was gone. The forest was normal again. Birds calling, wind in the branches, all the usual ambient noise returned. Like nothing had happened. I loaded my bike onto my car with shaking hands. There were 2 other vehicles in the parking area now, a truck and a Subaru, other riders who'd come and gone while I was out there. Normal Saturday activity, normal world. But I kept looking at the trees, at the dark line where the forest began, expecting to see something watching from the shadows. I haven't been back to Tillamook. Can't bring myself to ride those trails again. I've done research since, historical records, folklore, reports from other trail users. The Tillamook burn destroyed 355,000 acres of old-growth forest, wiped out entire ecosystems, killed everything in massive firestorms that burned so hot they sterilized the soil, and then humans replanted it, forced it back into being a forest with 72 million seedlings arranged in perfect rows. But what if we brought something back wrong? What if the forest that grew from those ashes isn't quite the same as what was there before? What if something filled the empty spaces? Something that learned to move through the uniform trees and dense undergrowth? Something that watches the trails and follows the riders? I still mountain bike. But I stay on popular trails now, places with cell service and other riders, routes where you're never more than a mile from roads and parking areas. I don't ride Tillamook. I don't ride deep forest. And I don't ride alone anymore, because I know now that solitude in the woods isn't about being by yourself. It's about what else is there with you, watching from the trees, matching your pace, waiting for you to understand that you were never alone to begin with. If you're reconsidering your solo rides after this, Good. Subscribe to Haunted Fears. These Oregon accounts are finished, but the horror never stops. Hit like if you'll never look at regrowth forests the same way. Remember, some things in the woods don't want to catch you. They just want you to know they're there. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next series. She was right next to me, complaining about the hill climb. Then she was just gone. Not grabbed, not fallen, just erased from existence for 6 hours that she swears never happened. My name is Gideon, and I lost my best friend on Mount David. Not lost like she died. Lost like our reality split in two, and we each lived a different version of the same night. We still see each other sometimes, but there's this gulf between us now, this fundamental disagreement about what happened on October 17th that neither of us can bridge. My friend and I had been close since middle school. We'd grown up together in Eugene, went to the same high school, ended up at the same community college. We were the kind of friends who didn't need to talk constantly, but were always there when it mattered. She was studying graphic design. I was working toward a forestry degree. We both loved hiking, exploring abandoned places, chasing local legends and ghost stories. Mount David in Cottage Grove was one of those places we'd heard about for years. It's a 760-foot butte right in the middle of town, covered in Douglas fir and oak, with trails winding up to the summit. The locals treat it like a park. There are trails, viewpoints, places to sit and look out over the Willamette Valley. But there's also history there, dark history. The Pioneer Cemetery dates back to the 1850s, established by one of the earliest settlers. It's small, maybe 20 graves, tucked into a clearing about halfway up the mountain. Old weathered headstones, some so worn you can't read the names anymore. And there's a local legend that everyone in Cottage Grove knows. Leave before sunset. There's supposed to be a spirit on the mountain that chases away visitors after dark. We'd heard the stories. My friend and I had even talked about checking it out, but it was one of those things we never got around to. Then October came, midterms finished, and we both had a free weekend. She texted me Friday afternoon. Mount David tonight, full moon, perfect for cemetery pics. I should have said no, should have remembered the warnings, should have suggested we go during daylight. But I was 21 and stupid and didn't believe in ghosts despite all the stories we'd collected. We drove down to Cottage Grove around 7 p.m., parked at the base of Mount David as the sun was setting. The mountain rises right out of the residential area. You can literally park on a street corner and walk straight onto the trails. We had flashlights, phones fully charged, a camera for her photos. Just a quick hike up to the cemetery, get some atmospheric shots in the moonlight, hike back down, an hour, maybe 2. The trail was steep but well-maintained, switchbacking up through the trees. We passed a few people coming down, a couple with a dog, a jogger, some teenagers. Everyone heading off the mountain as darkness fell. We were the only ones going up. "You think the ghost story is real?" she asked as we climbed. She was ahead of me, setting the pace, her flashlight bobbing on the trail. "Probably just something locals made up to keep teenagers from partying up here," I said. "Or maybe it's real, and we're about to find out." We reached the cemetery around 7:45, twilight fading fast into night. The clearing was small, ringed by old oaks, the headstones scattered in no particular pattern. Some were upright, some tilted, a few fallen completely. The oldest dates we could make out were from the 1850s and 60s, pioneers who'd come west on the Oregon Trail and settled in this valley. She started taking photos immediately, using her phone's night mode to capture the moonlit headstones. I walked the perimeter, reading inscriptions where I could, trying to imagine what life was like for these people. Died at 35, died at 19, died at 3 months old. The brutal reality of frontier life carved into weathered stone. "This one's sad," she called out. She was crouched by a small headstone near the center of the clearing. A whole family, mother, father, 3 kids. All died within 2 weeks of each other in 1862, probably disease. I walked over to look. The stone was more detailed than the others, better preserved, with all 5 names listed and a Bible verse I couldn't quite read in the dim light. "Let's get a few more shots and head down," I said. "It's getting cold." 5 more minutes, she said, moving to another cluster of graves. "The light is perfect right now." I stood by that family headstone, watching her work. She was maybe 30 feet away, at the edge of the clearing near where the trail continued up toward the summit. Her flashlight illuminated each stone as she photographed it, her silhouette backlit by moonlight. "You know what's weird," she said, not looking up from her camera. "I haven't heard any birds or—" And she was gone. Not like she walked away. Not like she ducked behind something. 1 second she was there, crouched by a headstone talking. The next second, nothing. Empty space. Her voice cutting off mid-word, mid-syllable. "Hey," I called out. Maybe she'd moved behind a tree, maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the dark. No response. I walked quickly to where she'd been. Her flashlight was on the ground, still lit, lying next to the headstone she'd been photographing. But my friend was gone. I called her name again, louder now, panic creeping in. "This isn't funny." I searched the clearing, looked behind every headstone, every tree, called out over and over, checked my phone, no missed calls, no texts. I called her number. It rang, but I couldn't hear it nearby. It went to voicemail. This wasn't possible. People don't just vanish. She had to be somewhere, playing a prank, hiding, something. I ran down the trail toward the parking area, thinking maybe she'd gone back to the car for some reason. The trail was steep and dark, and I nearly fell twice, branches whipping my face. I reached the car, locked, empty, no sign of her. I called 911, told them my friend had disappeared on Mount David, that I couldn't find her, that something was wrong. The dispatcher was calm, asked me questions I could barely answer. How long had she been missing? 10 minutes. 15. I didn't know. Had we been fighting? No. Was she familiar with the area? No. Could she have gotten lost on other trails? Maybe. I didn't know. I didn't know anything except that she had been there, and now she wasn't. The police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 officers with powerful flashlights and radios. I led them up to the cemetery, explained what happened, showed them where she'd been standing, pointed out her flashlight still lying on the ground. They searched. Called in more officers, brought search and rescue volunteers, covered every trail on the mountain. They asked me the same questions over and over. Had we been drinking? No. Drugs, no. Had she seemed upset or suicidal? No. Was there any reason she might run away? No, no, no. Hours passed. They brought in dogs. The dogs found her scent in the cemetery, tracked it to the exact spot where she'd vanished, and then nothing. The scent just stopped, like she'd evaporated. Her parents arrived, frantic. Her father yelled at me, demanded to know what I'd done with his daughter. Her mother just cried. I had no answers. I sat on the ground by that family headstone and stared at the empty space where my best friend had been. At 1:47 a.m., she walked out of the trees at the edge of the clearing. She looked confused, disoriented, squinting in the glare of all the flashlights suddenly pointed at her. "What's going on?" she asked. "Why is everyone here?" Her mother ran to her, grabbed her, held her while sobbing. The police converged, asking questions. She looked around at all of us like we were crazy. "I was standing right here," she said, pointing to the spot. "Taking photos." "Where did you go?" "I've been here the whole time," I said, walking over. "You disappeared. You've been gone for 6 hours." She stared at me. "What are you talking about?" "I was right here. You're the one who disappeared. I called your name like 50 times and you didn't answer. Then all these people showed up." The police questioned her. Medical evaluation, basic cognitive tests, checking for signs of trauma or intoxication. She was fine, physically fine, but her timeline made no sense. According to her, I'd vanished. She'd been standing by the headstones, turned to say something to me, and I was gone. She'd searched for maybe 3 minutes, calling my name, getting increasingly worried. Then suddenly there were flashlights and police and her parents, and everyone was acting like she'd been missing for hours. "My phone says 7:51 p.m., she insisted, showing the screen to anyone who'd look. But everyone else's phones showed 1:47 a.m., 6 hours difference. They took us both to the hospital for observation, checked us for concussions, drug screenings, psychological evaluation. Everything came back normal. Neither of us could explain what happened. We'd both experienced the other person vanishing. We'd both searched. We'd both been terrified. But our timelines didn't match. Couldn't match. I'd lived through 6 hours of horror, searching and waiting and fearing the worst. She had experienced maybe 3 minutes of confusion before finding herself surrounded by rescuers. The police investigated, found no evidence of foul play, no evidence of anything unusual. The official report listed it as a misunderstanding, a case of two people losing track of each other in the dark and panicking. But that didn't explain the timeline discrepancy. Didn't explain how her phone showed 7:51 p.m. when it was actually almost 2 a.m. Didn't explain how search dogs tracked her scent to a specific point and then lost it completely. We tried to stay friends. We really did. But how do you maintain a friendship when you can't agree on basic reality? When you each lived through a different version of the same event? Every time we talked about that night, we'd end up arguing. She insisted I'd abandoned her, disappeared without warning, left her alone in a dark cemetery. I insisted she'd vanished into thin air, causing a 6-hour search and rescue operation. Neither of us could accept the other's version. And the gap between those versions, 6 hours of missing time, of displaced reality, it broke something between us that couldn't be fixed. I've researched Mount David obsessively since that night. The Pioneer Cemetery, the local legends, the history. The Kalapuya considered it a sacred site. There were burial sites on the slopes, a culturally important rock outcropping at the base that's still used for spiritual purposes, and that warning everyone knows, leave before sunset. There's supposed to be a spirit that chases away visitors after dark. But what if it doesn't chase you away? What if it displaces you, puts you somewhere else, when else, for however long it decides? I think that's what happened to us. We crossed some threshold, violated some boundary by being there after dark, and the mountain, or whatever lives on it, separated us, put us in different timelines, different versions of the same moment. She experienced 3 minutes. I experienced 6 hours. But we were both there, both real, both searching for each other across a gap that shouldn't exist. I don't go to Cottage Grove anymore. Can't drive past Mount David without my hands shaking. And I sure as hell never go near that cemetery, especially not after dark. My friend and I don't talk now. Haven't spoken in almost 2 years. 'Cause how do you bridge a gap like that? How do you reconcile two mutually exclusive experiences of the same event? She thinks I abandoned her. I know she vanished. And somewhere on Mount David, in that pioneer cemetery from the 1850s, the truth exists in a space neither of us can access. The locals know to leave before dark. They've known for generations. And now I know too. Some places have rules that don't make sense until you break them. Some boundaries are invisible until you cross them. And some nights split into different timelines, trapping friends on opposite sides of reality with no way back to each other. If you've ever wondered why local legends exist, why small towns have warnings that seem superstitious, this is why. Subscribe to Haunted Fears because we're diving deeper into places where reality breaks and time doesn't work right. Hit that like button if you'll never ignore a leave before sunset warning again. And remember, some friendships don't survive when you each live through a different version of the same horror. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next terrifying account.